Yes, yes, yes. What's happening, people? Welcome aboard the night flight. It's certainly nighttime where I am. It may not be where you are, but it's the night flight all the same. Shout out to everyone in the live chat. Let's see who we got in here. We're going to start off with some boxing talk. There was a heavyweight fight this evening. We'll talk about it. Let's just acknowledge some people here. Big up Striker. Big up Ade. Mr. Murray, big up. Yep, everyone, if you can hit the like button, be much appreciated. Big up, big up. Ade in London. Big up Hannibal Beats. Baz Newton in the place. JM, what's up? Where's Carlos? I like the name. Where's Carlos? Shout out to Where's Carlos. Shout out to KDV, Sean Baker, Julius, McNoctus. I think I've shouted out Baz Newton. Eggsy, Lexio, Earth Summed. Who else we got in here? Sazad, big up. We got Wild Camping Seamus. Big up Charles B every time. Jupiter String, yes, yes. Apex Bossman. Johan Tons. Danny Kocher. Martin Wood Wilkinson. Big up Ali in the chat. Says Deontay Wilder was down at the fight in Dubai, yep, and he faced off with Derek Chisora. Benjamin says Pulev got splattered art attack style. Big up HA. AJ14, big up, big up. Philip Answer. This is a night flight, so it's not strictly boxing related topics. It can be anything. We're going to start off with some boxing. So this evening we had the fight between Kubrat Pulev, big up Warren Williams, Kubrat Pulev and Murat Gassiev. Now, as far as I'm aware, because I've seen Gareth A. Davis say something which seemed to contradict what I'm about to say here, but as far as I'm aware, this was for the WBA regular heavyweight title. Okay, but again, I saw Gareth A. Davis do an interview saying it may not be for whatever reason, but again, as far as I'm aware, it was. Big up Lakvinder Singh. So the champion, Kubrat Pulev, defending the title against Murat Gassiev ostensibly. Pulev, who is 44 years of age, was in there against a Gassiev, who's obviously a former cruiserweight champion, a man over a decade younger. And although it was a spectacular knockout win for Gassiev, very reminiscent, by the way, of the Vladimir Klitschko Kubrat Pulev knockout. You guys remember that? Where Klitschko, who dropped Pulev several times earlier on in the fight, landed an enormous left hook, which deposited Pulev flat on his back and ended the fight. This, very similar, but different circumstances, because this was a fight that Kubrat Pulev was winning. And that right there is the biggest takeaway of this fight for me. As Dwyer always likes to say, knockouts cause amnesia. So, people are going to look at the fact that Murat Gassiev scored this spectacular knockout. Will Team Atauma still be keen on fighting the winner since Gassiev won in such spectacular fashion? But again, what preceded that knockout was a 44-year-old Kubrat Pulev outboxing Murat Gassiev. Bear in mind, this is the same Gassiev who was not just outboxed and beaten by Otto Wallin, but also hurt in that fight against Otto Wallin. You guys remember that? That was actually the fight, I think, prior to Wallin fighting AJ. He fought, outboxed, and hurt Murat Gassiev. All right, and that fight, I think, was actually in Russia. Was it in Turkey or was it in Russia? I want to say it was in Russia, but don't quote me. So, other than the big left hook, I don't really think that Gassiev has got much that Hatman needs to be concerned about. And Hatman's been in there, obviously mainly in sparring, but certainly in amateur fights with big punchers, big guys. I think Hatman would smoke Murat Gassiev, to be honest with you. I think he'd smoke him, especially if you can put him on the back foot. He's much faster. He's bigger. I know Gassiev is about 6'3", Hatman's about 6'4", but Hatman is like naturally heavier and whatnot. Gassiev doesn't have any head movement, really. He was getting totally outboxed by an old man. The old man got a little complacent, or maybe it's just father time, right? Not being quick enough to react. Didn't keep his right hand up. And he got caught with a shot that he's always been vulnerable for, or vulnerable to, which is a left hook. The very same left hook that knocked him out in the Klitschko fight. I mean, AJ hit him with some left hooks as well. Johan says, has Gassiev ever been down? I'm not sure, but he was certainly wobbled, noticeably wobbled by Otto Wallin, which is a concern, right? If you're getting wobbled by Otto Wallin, not that Gassiev's got a weak chin, you know, I'm not saying he's got a glass jaw or anything, but yeah, if you're getting wobbled by a guy like Otto Wallin, also a southpaw, then Hatman's going to do a lot more than that to you. If he hits you, you know? So we got some stills here of the KO. There's a left hook going in. You can see where Kubrat Pulev's right hand is. It's not where it should be. Murat Gassiev spotted the opening, reacted quickly. Obviously, over a decade younger than Pulev, so he did have the reflexes to pull the trigger. And down went Kubrat, heavy, and he could not beat the count. So that's all she wrote. It was a spectacular KO, but as I say, what preceded it was far from impressive by Murat Gassiev. Johan says, that's a good result because I wouldn't want to see Kubrat versus Moses. Okay, Warren Williams says it was for the WBA regular, I just checked. Eggsy says, is Gassiev a legit 6'3"? I thought he was smaller. Looked a lot smaller than Usyk. As far as I can remember, I think he was around the same height as Usyk. I think he's a legit 6'3", but who knows? Animal Beat says, laid out like he just got off work. Yeah, something like that. Pick up Ali, he says, according to Wilder, it seems the fight is going ahead. He is in good spirits to be taking the fight. Yeah, and you know what, Ali? Wilder seems in very good spirits. I saw an interview that he did with Talk Sport, and that's the happiest, the most buoyant I've seen Deontay Wilder for quite some time. And you know the saying, a happy fighter is a dangerous fighter. So maybe Deontay might be a little more energized. I would expect him to be a bit more energized if he got the fight against Usyk, but I still don't think he's gonna have enough to pose Usyk any problems. I mean, we're talking about a prime Deontay Wilder getting totally outboxed for, what was it, 6 or 7 rounds against an ancient Luis Ortiz. That was Wilder in his prime. Wilder in his prime also was totally outboxed, in my opinion at least, never mind what the judges were saying, because the judges actually had Wilder up in this fight at the time of the KO, but he was being outboxed by Artur Spilka in his prime until he landed a knockout shot late in that fight. So you look at all that and you think, or I think, there's just no way that Deontay Wilder lands a big shot and knocks out Alexander Usyk. I don't see it at all. Obviously, it's technically possible, but I think it's highly improbable that Wilder lands any big shot to knock Usyk out. And Usyk's got a great chin anyway. That's right, big up Andre Rodriguez. He says Pulev is what, 44? Yes, he is indeed, 44 years of age. Big up G-Man, Liam Goff in the chat. Salute, salute. GMS Nightmare says, do you think Wilder can beat Pulev now? You know what? Wilder versus Pulev is actually a really close fight based upon their most recent performances. Wilder against, what was the journeyman he just fought? I forget his name. But Wilder looked terrible, bro. Like, from a confidence perspective, he looked better. But he just had no snap on his shots. There was no speed there. There was maybe a lack of energy. He just didn't look good. He looked like an old man. We got Gaz for the super chat. He says, what's up, Hatman? How special was Holyfield in the 90s? Holyfield was a special fighter, more so because of his mentality than his ability. And he had considerable ability, obviously. But he wasn't as technically proficient as someone like Usyk, for example, who he's often compared to for obvious reasons, right? Both undisputed cruiserweight champions moving up, becoming undisputed heavyweight champions. So Holyfield wasn't as technically good as Usyk, but he was extremely tenacious. And he had these brutal fights at cruiserweight with the likes of Dwight Muhammad Qawi, the first fight. And he gained a reputation at cruiserweight for being somebody that could hang tough. When he moved up to heavyweight, he took on, lower tier opponents and fought his way to the mandatory position. It was mandatory for Mike Tyson, but Mike Tyson got knocked out by Buster Douglas. So Holyfield ended up challenging Buster Douglas for the heavyweight title instead. So up until that point, yeah, Holyfield had shown some guts in his cruiserweight fights, but at heavyweight, he was largely untested. Goes in there against Buster Douglas, wipes him out in 3 rounds. People are very impressed, but Douglas wasn't in anywhere near the kind of shape that he was in when he fought Tyson. So he then defends against George Foreman, who was in his, late 30s, early 40s at the time? I forget exactly how old Foreman was. I think he might have been about 40. He goes in there and he was, I want to say expected. That was the expectation. He was supposed to go in there and stop George Foreman because he's an old man. Holyfield ended up going the distance. He won most rounds, but he got rocked a couple times and he went the distance. And that was the start of the Holyfield skepticism. The public very skeptical, the boxing pundits and whatnot, the writers were skeptical because they're comparing him to Mike Tyson, right? This is directly off the back of the Mike Tyson era. Holyfield is the next significant heavyweight champion because obviously Buster Douglas was a one-hit wonder. So Holyfield takes over as undisputed heavyweight champion, but he doesn't reign with the kind of dominance that Mike Tyson was reigning with. So he came up for an awful lot of criticism, awful lot of skepticism from the public and the boxing media. So off the back of the Foreman fight, which people weren't particularly impressed by as far as Holyfield's performance, he then fights Burt Cooper. It was supposed to originally be Mike Tyson on that night, but Tyson ended up with some legal problems, right? Which we all know about, well documented. So a guy called Francesco Damiani, an Italian heavyweight, was supposed to replace Mike Tyson. But then Damiani pulled out something like a week or so before the fight, maybe 2 weeks. And he was replaced by Burt Cooper, who, funny enough, was actually mandatory for Holyfield's cruiserweight title back when Holyfield was still a cruiserweight. And Cooper came in as a late substitute. By this point, Cooper was basically just a journeyman, a heavyweight. And he proceeded to give Holyfield hell and high water. Holyfield received the first count of his career in that fight. Cooper caught him with a big right hand in, I think it was round 2. Holyfield took a count because the ropes held him up. And yeah, they had a firefight until Holyfield stopped him maybe in about 6 rounds or something. But at that stage, yeah, the skepticism about Holyfield was just off the charts. Okay, people were saying, nah, man, this guy, he's brave, but he's not up to much as a heavyweight champion. Then he goes in and fights a 41-year-old, I think he might have been, Larry Holmes. struggles in that fight too. Does win legitimately on points, but struggles. And people are like, nah, Holyfield's not the guy. He's very brave and everything, but he's not the guy. We need a real heavyweight champion. And people were touting Riddick Bowe as maybe being the heir apparent to Mike Tyson. He comes along, of course, in the very next fight and beats Holyfield. So at that stage, you know, the bravery that Holyfield showed in that Bowe fight, people were, you know, applauding it and whatnot. But they were saying, well, there you go. It proves what we were saying all along. That Holyfield, as gallant as he is and as much bravery as he showed in his career, particularly in that Bowe fight, he just wasn't up to much as a heavyweight champion. But then something unexpected happens. Holyfield comes back, he beats Alex Stewart in a rematch. And then he goes on to rematch Riddick Bowe and pulls off the upset. He was expected to lose again and get stopped in the second Bowe fight, but instead he goes in there in the famous Fan Man fight and scores an upset victory on points. And that was really the start of what Holyfield became remembered for as a heavyweight. Somebody that kept upsetting the odds, but also somebody that was inconsistent, because right after the Bowe fight, he fights Michael Moorer and loses. You know, so Holyfield had this kind of up and down championship career at heavyweight, where he would come out with brilliant performances and score upsets, but then lose to somebody who you'd expect him to beat in the next fight. So, yeah, that's what I would say about Holyfield in terms of how special he was. He was special in his ability to show up and win fights against the odds, but then he would lose fights that people expected him to win or look bad in fights that people expected him to dominate. You know what I mean? So that's how I describe Holyfield. I know it's a long-winded answer, but yeah. Shout out to Gaz for the super chat. Big up D-Man for the super chat. He says, big up Hatman. The disrespect for AJ is crazy. Heard Logan telling Jake, just come forward and he will crumble, which I thought was the opposite. Big up D-Man. In fact, let's come on to some AJ-related discussion here, right? David Haye, of all people, is now basically picking Jake Paul to win. You can see the interview thumbnail on screen, IFL TV. David Haye saying, bet on Jake Paul to win by crazy decision. Now, David Haye's prediction record is so unbelievably bad that it's actually remarkable. Because if you think about it, and, you know, just to make a point here, I like David Haye as a pundit. I find him entertaining, okay? I found him an entertaining character in the boxing world when he was still active. But his prediction record is so bad that it's remarkable because, again, think about it. Even if you've got no knowledge of boxing whatsoever, you've literally got a 50% chance of getting any prediction right. The fact that David Haye seems to have a far lower than 50% prediction record, that actually takes some doing. Do you know what I mean? Like, bro, that takes some doing. How is this guy managing to get a far less than 50% prediction record in boxing? That's actually mad. That's crazy. Man's got a less than 50% prediction record in boxing. Big up Ben Oldham for the super chat. No comment on that one, just a super chat. Much appreciated, my bro. Hope you're enjoying your evening. Big up Ben Oldham every time. Hannibal Beat says Holyfield was exciting. Holyfield certainly was exciting. He had an exciting style, and he was in some absolute thrilling fights. Andre Rodriguez says, Tony Yoka, what happened with the guy? Well, he lost, I think, 3 fights in a row. He lost to Martin Bakole, he lost to Takam, and he lost to a cruiserweight called Rayad Murray, who was totally outboxed by Jared Anderson in a little stay busy fight. So after those 3 losses on the bounce, he faded off into obscurity, basically, Tony Yoka. I think he got divorced or broke up with his girlfriend, wife, whoever she was, who was also a boxer. And last I heard of him, I haven't actually seen him fight in years, but last I heard of him, he was fighting in obscure fights in the UK, bear in mind he's French, being trained by Don Charles. Because for a long time in his career, he was based in the United States and he was being trained by Virgil Hunter. But yeah, in more recent years, he's been trained by Don Charles, fighting obscure fights in the UK, none of which I've seen. That's what's going on with Tony Yoka. So yeah, the fact that David Haye is picking Jake Paul to win is kind of ominous for Jake Paul. You know, whoever you are, ideally you want David Haye to be picking against you in a fight. Then you'll feel at ease, right? Big up Ben Oldham for the super chat again. Much appreciated, my bro. Big up D-Man for the super chat. He says, I think the disrespect will surely motivate AJ. You know, it's kind of interesting because I've never seen AJ so relaxed before a fight. And I'm not really sure how to feel about that. AJ is somebody who doesn't handle pressure well compared to other top flight heavyweights. If you want to say that AJ is still a top flight heavyweight, that's very debatable. But you know what I mean. Over the past 10 years, he's been one of the top heavyweights. And he doesn't have, well, how can I describe this? Even though he's been under a lot of pressure, maybe more pressure than his contemporaries, he doesn't tend to deal with the pressure as well. He's not as good of a big occasion fighter as, let's say, a Usyk or a Partridge. Do you know what I mean? Those guys seem to thrive more on a big occasion, whereas AJ gets like really nervous and tends to underperform on a big occasion. Here against Jake Paul, in all the interviews, the press conference, he seems uncharacteristically relaxed. Is that a good thing? Or is that a sign that he's maybe not paying Jake Paul the level of respect that he needs to? At the end of the day, he's still a man over 200 pounds. He's young, he's athletic, he can throw some big punches. Or is that actually ominous for Jake Paul that AJ's so relaxed? Is that going to be an indication that AJ's just going to handle this guy with ease? Because if AJ's relaxed and he's on it, and he's mentally focused and sharp, it could be a horrible, horrible drubbing of a fight. I'm expecting AJ to be somewhat circumspect. I've been saying this for the past few streams. I think he'll come out and have a look and kind of stay behind his jab and move around and whatnot and see what shots he can land at long range. And then once he feels comfortable enough, then he'll maybe step it up a bit. I'm expecting this fight to go rounds. I don't think it's going to be over in a round or two. I reckon this maybe goes at least 6 or 7 rounds, possibly even a distance. And I think there'll be a lot of criticism of AJ after the fight. People saying he should have wiped Jake Paul out in a round or two. It's disgraceful that he's been taken so many rounds, even though he's won the fight. I think that'll be the narrative after the fact. That AJ will win, but people will be heavily critical because of the fact he went so many rounds. Big up Jaden Ellis for the super, big up D-Man, by the way. Big up Jaden Ellis for the super chat. He says, thoughts on Sam Loco, ozone layer. Sam Loco is, without a shadow of a doubt, one of my favorite Nollywood actors of all time. I always, even now, watch Sam Loco movies. Sam Loco, Mr. Ibu, Akiam Popo, Bruno. I'm not talking about the Ali G character Bruno. I'm talking about the Nollywood actor Bruno, who's since passed away. And obviously Sam Loco passed away many years ago. Mr. Ibu passed away a year or two ago. Bruno passed away some years ago. Of that like old school crop of Nollywood actors, obviously Aki and Popo are still alive. Osuofia is still alive, he's not that old. But yeah, massive fan of Sam Loco. Massive fan. And I'm gonna continue to reiterate what I was saying years ago. There is an untapped, or there was an untapped gold mine and treasure trove of actors in Nigeria who are not being utilized by, let's just say, Black Hollywood in particular. A lot of the Black American directors and whatnot, when they're making like African movies or African themed movies, somehow they always want to cast Black Americans or even Black Brits to play Africans. Like, what are you doing? You cast actual African actors. Do you know what I mean? There's plenty of them around. You know, especially in Nollywood. So, yeah. Big up Jaden Ellis. Shout out to Super for the super chat. He says, who are the 5 best hard-hitting counterpunchers of all time in your opinion? Okay, that's a broad question, and I couldn't really give you an accurate answer off the top of my head like that. 1 second. Sorry about that, peeps. Where was I? All right. The 5 best hard-hitting counterpunchers of all time, in my opinion. All right, let's have a think about this. Hard-hitting counterpunchers. Marquez has got to be up there. He was a great hard-hitting counterpuncher. So let's put Marquez up there. Especially once he bulked up and started looking like a linebacker for, what was it, the 4th Pacquiao fight? Did he fight Pacquiao 4 times or 5 times? I forget now, but the last time he knocked Pacquiao cold, and he literally looked like a linebacker. So I'm gonna put Marquez in there. Who else am I gonna put in there? Hard-hitting counterpunchers of all time. I might put Canelo in there. Canelo's a good counterpuncher, and he hit hard, particularly super middleweight. Very good counterpuncher. Who else am I going to put in there? Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson's known as an aggressive pressure fighter, but he was a great counterpuncher. So Mike Tyson will go in there too. 2 more. Hard-hitting aggressive counterpunchers. Wouldn't really put Tommy. I mean, Tommy Hearns could counter, but he was more of a lead rather than a counter. But he was good at countering, you know, with the right hand and whatnot. He'd catch a slipping. Who else am I going to put in there? Racking my brains now. And I have to just give you 3. Because there are so many. I mean, Finito Lopez, maybe. There are just so many fighters, literally thousands of fighters that I watched over the years. It's hard to pick 5 off the top of the head. To hell with it. We'll stick Finito Lopez in there and remix what I said about Tommy Hearns and stick him in there as well. There's your 5. Big up Super for the super chat. Much appreciated, much respect. Let's make sure I got all the super chats here. Big up Gaz, he says, Luke versus Huey Partridge and how? It's got to be Luke Partridge, man. It's got to be Luke Partridge all day over Huey. And I would say, if he's really on it, he can probably stop Huey. But more realistically, probably on points, but quite comfortably. I don't see Huey giving Luke any real problems. Shout out to D-Man for the super chat. He says, what's your opinion on the whole Somali thing going on in America? Also, they mandated now you have to show your social media. Where are we at? Yeah, you have to show your social media coming into the USA now. Is that right? Well, anyone who thought that Trump was looking to drain the swamp and that Trump was somehow anti-establishment, you should know better than that now. Because he also signed an executive order the other day, basically blocking states in America from regulating AI. Did you hear about this? He signed an executive order to block states from putting regulations on AI, limiting the way that AI can be used, right, by companies and whatnot. I mean, that's not an anti-establishment move. And I haven't heard about this having to show your social media to come into the USA, but yeah. Some people are going to say, well, that's good because immigrants are all evil and this and that. But it's a slippery slope. You know, once they start doing that, then it's a step along the road to everyone having to provide credentials to access social media. Do you know what I mean? But big up Demon. And as far as the Somali thing going on, I don't really know too much about it. It's with regards to the city of Minnesota. Trump is claiming that Somalia is one of the worst places to live in the world. I mean, it might be. Can't imagine it's an amazing place to live. But the Somali community in Minnesota, I really don't know much about the Somali community in Minnesota. All I can tell you about is the Somali community in London, which I know a lot about. The Somali community, like every migrant community, you know, when you're starting at the bottom, because as most migrants are, right, economic migrants, you're starting at the bottom. So you're going to be in the inner cities. You're not going to have the most amount of money. And when you start at the bottom, obviously, there's going to be a criminal element in your community, right? It was the same for the Irish. When the Irish first arrived in the United States, they started at the bottom, particularly being Catholics. And so there grew a large Irish criminal element, okay? The same happened with the Italians, obviously. Most famously with the Italian immigrants in the late 1800s, early 1900s, whatever it was. The Italians, their criminal element got so powerful in the United States that they damn near took over the country, right? The mafia. So these immigrant groups, historically, because they tend to start at the bottom, right? We're talking about economic migrants now, just as the Italians were, just as the Irish were, economic migrants into the United States. Yeah, they tend to start at the bottom, and they have a criminal element in their communities. And they gradually, over generations, lift themselves out of the poverty trap, and with it, their criminal element doesn't disappear completely, but it becomes far less visible and far less impactful on a street level. As far as visible, you know, crimes and whatnot. Somalis in London, okay, they have a criminal element to them, but the Somali communities are never that dangerous, right? There's a lot of Somalis in places like Tottenham, in Woolwich, Streatham, right? And various other parts of London you find Somalis. And like I say, Somali gangs can be formidable, but there's never been a Somali neighborhood during my time living in London, which was like as notorious as certain, let's say, Caribbean neighborhoods. Somalis practice group economics. So when you go into Somali communities in London, you see that they have all their shops, they shop at their own shops, they keep their money within their community. And most migrant groups do this. Not all, but most migrant groups do this. They keep their money flowing within their community. It's called group economics. 1 second, folks, hold that thought. All right, we're back. So like I was saying about Somalis in London, long story short, Somalis in London have pretty, cohesive communities, working class communities, predominantly working class communities. And although there's a criminal element, look, I'm not involved in the world of crime and whatnot. So maybe I've lost touch with regards to the hierarchy of different migrant groups in London and, whose criminal element is more powerful on the criminal totem pole. But Somalis, for example, my perception always was, we're nowhere near as formidable in the criminal world as, let's say, the Turks, right? The Turks in London, they're formidable, okay? Because of, I don't want to talk too much about it, but the Turks, their criminal element was very formidable. Afghans as well to some extent, and I'm sure you can understand why, because brown comes through from Afghanistan, through Turkey and all that kind of stuff. So the Turks, Afghans are formidable. The Somalis, I don't know, but they were never as big a factor, as far as I was aware, in the criminal world as various other migrant groups. So what the issue is with them in Minnesota, maybe it's more because they're just so prolific when it comes to their businesses and what have you in somewhere like Minnesota. People are not used to maybe Somali culture and seeing a bunch of Somalis around. And Somalis tend to be very insular, in case you don't know. Insular meaning they don't tend to socialize much outside of their own. They don't tend to marry much outside of their own or socialize much outside of their own, kind of like Chinese people, and various other groups. You know how Chinese people don't tend to really mix that much with other groups? Yeah, Somalis are kind of like that. They like to stay within their own and do their own thing and what have you. So maybe that's causing the issue, I don't know. Like I said, I don't really know much about the the Trump Somali thing. Is he using them as a scapegoat right now because there's some heat on him and eyes on him over other stuff? You guys let me know what you think. But big up D-Man for the super chat. Late to the party, what are we discussing? Whatever you guys want to discuss. Wave says Pacheco's getting knocked out tomorrow. I don't know too much about the guy that Pacheco's fighting. Who is he? Is he an African guy? Okay, it's from Cameroon. And Waved is saying Pacheco's getting knocked out by the Cameroonian. All right. Not sure I've seen him fight. Yeah, YouTube has got this like new UI for the live stream, and it's a little different to how it was last time I streamed, so let's get into grips with it here. Shout out to everyone locking in. Philip Anson says, Hatman, have you checked the news about Fury and AJ in 2026? What news is that? Turki Al-Sheikh alluded to a major fight in September next year, and we all assumed that he's alluding to AJ versus Partridge. If there's any news on it, it's news to me. Wave says, sources have advised the Ring that a highly anticipated showdown between former heavyweight champions Tyson Fury and Anthony Joshua will headline a Riyadh season mega event in 2026. Okay. Before that collision happens, the Ring has also learned that Fury and Joshua are slated to see action in separate fights as part of next year's Riyadh season. All right, well, that is kind of what was rumored the whole time, so they're confirming what's been rumored. Okay, shout out to Waved. Yeah, Somalis roll deep. As I said earlier on, Somalis are very insular. They don't really like mixing with even other Africans, right? Somalis just stay within the Somali community and roll with other Somalis and stuff like that. You don't really see them. I mean, some of them obviously roll with other Africans, but not really. They like to just stick to their own and do their own thing. And so it also goes for their criminal element. And indeed, they roll deep on a street level, right? Places like Finsbury, that kind of area, you see a lot of Somalis around there. Wood Green, you know what I mean? Wood Green area. Where's that place near Wood Green? I used to see a lot of Somalis around there. I'm talking about street guys. Turnpike Lane. I see a lot of Somali street guys around Turnpike Lane. Yeah, Wave, that's right, Turnpike Lane, yeah. Chase Greatness says, Somalis aren't black. I'm Somali and I'm not identifying as black. Yeah, a lot of Somalis do say that they don't identify as black, but what does that actually mean? Like, what do you mean by you're not black? Because you can't say your skin's not brown, because it is. I think what a lot of Somalis actually mean, without maybe having the language to describe it, is that they're not Bantu. Because the majority of black people are of a Bantu phenotype. Somalis obviously are not of a Bantu phenotype. Yeah, I've seen some of them try to claim Arab, but Arabs do not accept Somalis as Arabs at all. Arabs don't accept Somalis as being one of them. They don't accept Sudanese as being Arab either. So it's kind of a weird thing where like Somalis and Sudanese are like begging Arab, but Arabs don't accept them as Arabs. Arabs say that, no, you're Africans. You're not Arabs. So it's kind of weird. Well, that's what I mean, chasing greatness. I think what Somalis mean when they say they're not black is they're basically saying we're not Bantu. And that's right, most Somalis are not Bantu, but some Somalis actually are Bantu. There are Bantu Somalis, as in Somalis who don't look stereotypically Somali, but could pass for Ugandan or, do you know what I mean? Wherever. Okay, Chase Greatness says, I definitely don't claim Arab at all. Okay, that's cool. Warren Williams says, I always thought Somali was half Arab, half black. And not really. I mean, if you look at the genetics on average of Somalis, there's something like 60 to 70% African in their genetics, like black African in their genetics. So they're still genetically mostly black African with some admixture. Ed Ellaby says, Ethiopians, Somalis, and Eritreans aren't black. But again, how do you define black? And if they're not black, what are they? Because as I say, they've got more black in them, or, you know, black African in them genetically than anything else. So what are they? Where does one race start and another race end? It's kind of a vague thing. Once you get into the whole concept of race, because phenotypes are obviously a thing, right? We can see with our eyes there are different human phenotypes. When you start putting phenotypes under the class of a race, that's when it starts to get a little complicated. Like, where does one race start and the other race end? The lines are a little blurred at that stage. Do you know what I mean? Even Uncle Phil says majority African DNA usually means you are black. It's not difficult. Yeah, and again, if you look at the genetic studies that have been done on Somalis, Ethiopians, the people from the Horn of Africa, the majority of their genetics come from, or the majority of their genetics are black African. So, I don't know. Indeed, at that point, it becomes a spectrum. It's like, so for example, what race are Arabs? Are Arabs white? Are they Asian? Do you know what I mean? Like, how do you actually class Arabs racially? Because if you did genetic tests on Arabs, you'll find that they have, again, a mixture of genetics, some from Europe, some from Turkic peoples, some from Asia, and even some from Africa. Like, Arabs are not a genetically homogeneous group. Arabs are mixed. So what race are Arabs? People are saying they're Arabs are Turks. Well, no, they're not really, because in northern part of Arabia, right, Arabs look a certain way, but then in the southern part of Arabia, they look different, you know? Now, the royal families all look very similar, but in terms of like the actual population, because I'm someone that lived in the Middle East and I lived in several different countries, and Arabs look very different, you know what I mean? They're not all like a homogenous looking people. They've got mixture from Europe, Asia, and Africa in them over many centuries. So what race are Arabs? It doesn't matter whether the caliphate ruled Turks. I'm talking about Arabs today. Have you lived in the Middle East? I've lived in the Middle East in several countries. UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, etc. Right? Oman. Like, they don't all look, they're mixed looking people. Some of them have got curly hair. Some of them are quite dark in complexion. Others much lighter with like the kind of Turkic. I say Turkic, it's not really Turkic, because you do realize that the original Turks were actually Oriental. Do people know this in the chat? The original Turks were Oriental people, not the Turks we think of today. Yeah, the original Turks were Oriental. I think they were somehow descended from the Mongols. Don't quote me on that. The original Turks were Orientals. Indeed, some Arabs look Ethiopian, like Yemeni people. Yeah, they do. And that's because the Ethiopians actually, their empire, the Aksumite Empire, I think it was, extended into the Arabian Peninsula. So in the ancient world, the Ethiopians actually controlled southern Arabia. And during that time, they brought their people with them. So in places like Yemen and even Oman, you find a lot of Ethiopian-looking Arabs in southern Arabia who have been there for hundreds and hundreds of years, going all the way back at least to the Ethiopian Empire. We're talking about the early centuries AD. And those people are now classed as Arabs, right? But they look like Ethiopians. Let me just check. I hope I'm not missing any super chats here. No, I'm not. So yeah, the original Turks were Oriental. The Turks of today in Turkey itself, because there are Turkic people that live in Central Asia that are still Oriental in appearance. But the Turks that live in Turkey do not look Oriental. All right, they look kind of Eastern European, Mediterranean looking. But they're not the original phenotype of Turks. They're like a more modern version of Turks. Ocean Blue says, I'm from 2 Middle Eastern countries and I've got quite light skin, but curly hair that grows out like an afro, definitely a mixed picture. Yeah, Arabs are a mixed people. Yes, exactly that, Chasing Greatness. The original Turks had a similar look to Uzbekistanis. Actually, no, the original Turks were even more Oriental looking than that. Yeah, the Uzbekistanis do look somewhat Oriental. The original Turks were even more Oriental looking than that. Again, I think they spawned out of the Mongol Empire. And obviously the Mongols were Oriental people. Big up Abraham for the super chat. He says, what's up, Hatman? Champions should be mandatory to other champions. Imagine the embarrassment for Zerdo being stripped for dodging Opataya. Thoughts? Well, that's an interesting comment there. Shout out to Abraham. Because the WBC, for all their faults and all their effery, right? We don't big up the WBC very often. The WBC once were mandating their champions to defend the belt against other champions. It was a very brief period where they did this, but they mandated Golovkin. Was it Canelo to fight Golovkin? They mandated, I think, Adonis Stevenson to maybe fight Kovalev. There was a time where they were mandating their champions to fight the other champions. It only lasted a couple years, then they stopped doing it. I think they should all do it. All the sanctioning bodies should do it, but there's kind of a conflict of interest there, so they probably won't. Big up Abraham for the super chat. It would be good. Even Uncle Phil says Sky Nicholson getting a title shot after losing is wild. KDV says original Turks are in Turkmenistan. I don't know much about Turkmenistan, but admixture for many countries changes dramatically over time, you know? It's like if you were to say, if you were to talk about Mexican history, right? Most Mexicans today are mestizos. This is a Spanish word meaning mixed, as I understand it anyway. So the Mexicans today are not really the same people as the ones who were part of Mesoamerica in the ancient or pre-Columbus times. They have some DNA of those people, but they've got an awful lot of European admixture in them now. So they're not really, strictly speaking, the same people. They're partly descended from the original inhabitants of Mexico, right? But they're not like exactly the same. I mean, there are some pure-blooded Mexicans and indigenous Mesoamericans still alive, but there are very few of them in Mexico anyway. In places like Peru, there's a lot more of them, but in Mexico, there's not that many of them, right? There are a small percentage, the pure-blooded ones, very few of them. KDV says Canelo is definitely not part of that history. What do you mean he's not part of that history? Canelo's obviously somebody that has a lot of European DNA, but also some native DNA. If you look at his brothers and his mom, you can see there's definitely native DNA there, but for whatever reason with him, the European DNA has expressed itself more in his phenotype. Chase Greatness says, Hatman, what about Polynesian people? Are they a mix of African and Oriental people? See, that is that's kind of a difficult question to answer because of this. There have been melanated people, all right, people who look phenotypically quote unquote black, living in that part of the Pacific for thousands of years, all right? Genetically, if you do tests on people from Papua New Guinea who have afro hair, brown skin, broad noses, thick lips, who, you know, superficially they look like Africans, genetically, they're actually more closely related to Oriental people, which is weird, right? Because phenotypically, they don't look like Oriental people, they look far more like Africans. So again, this comes down to like, how do you define the race? Is it mostly based on the genetics or is it mostly based on the phenotype? But anyway, yeah, Polynesians clearly are a mix between Oriental, phenotypical Oriental people and the melanated people from the Pacific Islands, right? From places like Fiji, from places like Papua New Guinea. When you mix the Oriental phenotype with that Melanesian phenotype, you get the Polynesian people. Where's Carlos says, Cano is from a place in Mexico that has Irish DNA. Well, he might be, but that doesn't mean he has Irish DNA. If you've got red hair and you've got European ancestry, it's more likely to be Scottish. You know, the Irish, the red-haired Irish is quite a new thing. Scotland was more the place for red hair, more so than Ireland. Irish people historically have actually been more of darker complexion, like dark hair, you know, like the Furies? Irish people tended to look like that. The vast majority of Irish people were more like the Fury family. Red hair is not as prolific in Ireland as it is in Scotland. But yeah, with Canelo, he's obviously got a lot of European ancestry in him, but also he's got native ancestry too. Again, you look at his mum and his brothers, and the native ancestry is a lot more apparent in them than it is in Canelo. Shout out to Demon, he says, Polynesians and Melanesians are Asian, no African relation at all. People get this confused a lot. They are closer to Sri Lankans. Again, to say there's no African relation at all, I don't think that's necessarily accurate, because what you have to understand about genetics is that you get something called genetic bottlenecks, right? And over time, when particular groups remain on a certain part of the earth, they develop certain like genetic markers which identify them as being from part of a particular genetic pool, right? Now, Melanesians are superficially, phenotypically, they look like black Africans somewhat, right? They look far more similar to black Africans than they do to Orientals. But as you say, genetically, when you run the genetics on them, they appear to be more similar to Oriental people. That in itself is kind of odd, right? Because why would someone with like brown skin, afro hair, big lips, broad nose be genetically more similar to an Oriental than an African? And the reason is actually quite simple. Because genetic types do not remain the same over the course of hundreds or thousands of years. So for example, in Africa, modern Africans, I'm talking about black Africans now, do not have exactly the same genetics as ancient Africans. That's something people need to get their heads around. So there will be ancient populations of Africans who have left Africa, right, in the deep, deep antiquity, tens of thousands of years ago, who left Africa and lived outside of Africa for thousands of years, all right? Their genetics will now be different to modern Africans, even though they originated in Africa thousands of years ago. Genetics is, you know, the genotype of a particular group doesn't stay the same over the course of thousands of years. It evolves, it changes. Anyone who looks into genetics, you'll understand this to be the case. So, yeah, it's, what we can say is that Melanesians are not genetically similar to modern Africans, but it's possible that they are descended from extremely ancient Africans. Does that make sense? A big up D-Man for the super chat. So I'll give you an example, right? The indigenous people of Southern Africa are basically two groups, the Khoi and the San people. The Khoi and the San people lived in the deserts of Southern Africa and in the bush of Southern Africa, isolated pretty much from most other Africans for tens of thousands of years, all right? That is why the Khoi and the San look so different to other Africans, because they were genetically isolated from other Africans. And that's why genetically they're so different to other Africans. Yeah, you cannot, if you run like a genetic profile of a pure-blooded Khoisan person today, in no way would you mistake them for a Nigerian or a South Sudanese or a Ugandan. Their genetics are very, very different to other Black African groups because they've remained isolated from other Black, even though they were on the African continent, in the southern part of Africa. Up until relatively recent history, as far as we know, Southern Africa was virtually empty compared to, let's say, West Africa or East Africa, which were far more densely populated historically. Southern Africa, until relatively recently, past few thousand years, was very sparsely populated. And that's why the Khoi and the San people could remain virtually untouched by other Africans for tens of thousands of years. And so they developed like a different phenotype. They're much lighter skinned. They've got like slit eyes and, different type of facial features and whatnot. Yeah, it's an interesting thing. The original inhabitants of many Oriental countries were basically Melanesians. Yeah, these dark-skinned, afro-haired people. Again, you just call them Melanesians since there are still Melanesians around today. So the original inhabitants of Thailand, you'll still find them there living out in isolated areas. They were Melanesians and so on and so forth. They say the same also about the Japanese, although I don't know that much about that with regards to Japan, but certainly like places like the Philippines, Thailand, the original inhabitants appear to have been Melanesians. Well, yeah, the Aboriginals, that's a great thing there because, or a great example of what I was talking about with regards to the Khoi and the San people in Southern Africa, because the Aboriginals, of course, right, my live is frozen here. There's me talking and the chat's not moving. YouTube doing its usual thing. Make sure I open up another tab. It's all frozen. Apologies if I've missed anyone's super chat in the meantime. Let me check. Yeah, so the Aboriginal Australians remained isolated from everyone else pretty much in the world for thousands of years. That's why no other race today looks anything like Aboriginal Australians. Yeah, even other melanated groups in the Pacific don't look like the Aboriginal Australians for the most part. I mean, some of them do, but for the most part, they don't, right? The Aboriginal Australians have a unique look because they've been isolated from everyone else for thousands of years. This is what happens, like genetics and phenotype changes over time to some extent. They call it microevolution, right? So there may have been a time when the original people that inhabited Australia looked more similar to the people in other parts of Asia, or maybe they looked more similar to Africa. Maybe they came from Africa, who knows? But because of this genetic isolation, they started to look physically distinct. This is why I've always said that I do not buy this idea that which some Black Americans are pushing, that Black Americans are somehow indigenous to America and they didn't come over during slavery. I mean, I just don't buy it. Because if that was the case, then Black Americans would look phenotypically distinct from Africans, and they don't. I've heard some people claim they do. No. Only the Black Americans that have like white admixture or, other non-Black admixture look different to Africans. Most Black Americans, you could swap them out for Congolese and you wouldn't even know. Yeah, you go to Central Africa in particular because, the transatlantic slave trade originally was taking slaves from West Africa. But the longer the slave trade went on, they started moving down and into Central Africa, and the more recent slaves were taken from Congo. And bear in mind, the mortality rate of slaves was extremely high. So chances are most Black Americans are going to find that their genetic lineage is in Congo rather than somewhere like Nigeria. Some of them will find it's in Nigeria, but the majority of them, I would imagine, will be more so in Congo. Like Mike Tyson, for example, he ran his genetics and he found he's Congolese, right? So, and Mike Tyson looks Congolese, bro. Like most Black Americans look like Central Africans or West Africans. They're indistinguishable. So if they were living on the American continent even before the Europeans arrived, they'd look distinct from people in Africa, but they don't. So I don't buy it. Just as I've explained the Khoi and the San people in Africa, because they were not mixing with other Black Africans, they evolved to look physically distinct from other Black Africans, different. Yeah, that's what you would expect to see. Kayvon Green says it's called genetic drift. Indeed, Wilder could be swapped out for a Nigerian, nobody would know. Linkage says Tariq Nasheed putting out that nonsense. Wave says, I went to Qatar. I don't know if it's because I was born in London and been there my whole life, but it was way too empty for me. Seemed like there was barely anyone there. I like Qatar. I lived there for some time in Doha, loved it. I like a less densely populated environment personally. The high standard of living, the cheap cost of petrol, tax-free, obviously, and all that kind of stuff. I liked it. But it's each his own. D-Man says, like, you can't say Haitians or Jamaicans are not African. That indigenous thing is BS. I agree. I just don't buy it at all. Not only phenotypically, the Haitians and Jamaicans, etc., look like Africans, but you can see the cultural fingerprints, particularly with Haitians, you know? So, yeah, I don't buy it. Big up Kayvon Green. He says, almost all Black Americans have with blood. I'm not sure what you're trying to say there, Kayvon Green, but big up for the super chat. Maybe you can clarify in a follow-up comment. Or have African blood. Is that what you're saying? Yeah, the heat in Qatar is crazy. What country do I see myself settling in? Well, might be Zambia, bro. I like it in Zambia a lot. But I can tell you that the immigration process is not easy here. It's I'm finding it to be very challenging. KDV says, the Zulus and Khoisan look so different, crazy how they're from the same region. Well, the Khoisan are the original inhabitants of Southern Africa. The Zulus are part of the Bantu language group, and they're much more recent people to Southern Africa, because the Bantu tribes originated in West Africa. Yeah. So originally in Southern Africa, it was just the Khoi and the San people, who, as you say, look very different to Bantus. And then over the course of thousands of years, the Bantus basically trickled down from West Africa through Central Africa into Southern Africa. That's why you have these two distinct looks in Southern Africa. You have the people that have the more Khoisan genetics, and then people who have more Bantu genetics, and some people, of course, are an admixture of the two. D-Man says, do you think the Dutch actually got to SA before the Bantus, like they claim? Well, of course they didn't get to they didn't get to South Africa before they got, no, but the Dutch aren't really claiming that they got to South Africa before the Bantus. They're claiming that they were in South Africa before the Zulus. You see, it's kind of like a word trickery, because Zulus are a tribe, and they're a relatively recent tribe. So you don't go back thousands of years and find Zulus. The Zulus are a Bantu tribe, right? So how old is the Zulu tribe? Some people claim it's only 200 years old or something like that, right? So the Dutch are claiming that they were in South Africa before the Zulus. But again, that's kind of like word trickery, because the people who are Zulus today, their ancestors were in South Africa. They just weren't called Zulus. Do you see what I'm saying? So they were still there. They looked exactly the same. They just weren't called, they hadn't formed the Zulu tribe yet. So it's kind of like nonsense what they're talking about. Because the Bantu migration into Southern Africa happened thousands of years ago. Do you know what I mean? Thousands of years ago. That's when the Bantus came into this. It's not something that happened a couple hundred years ago. It's thousands of years ago. So it may be true that the arrival of the Dutch, so when the Dutch arrived in South Africa, did the Zulus exist as a tribe? Perhaps not. But the ancestors of the Zulus did exist, because the Zulus are just a tribe. Bantus were certainly in Southern Africa way before the Dutch arrived. That's the point. S says, damn, that's mad. Thought immigration would be easier to Zambia, especially coming from the West, the first world country. Well, the thing about a lot of these kind of obscure countries, because Zambia is obscure, right? The thing about a lot of these obscure countries is they're not used to people coming from the West wanting to settle here. They're not used to it. And because they're not used to it, they don't really have provisions for it. The immigration in a lot of these obscure countries tends to deal with people immigrating from other parts of Africa, or people immigrating from Asia, like India and stuff like that. So they're used to dealing with people from other developing countries. They're not used to dealing with a lot of people from, developed countries. So they don't really have like a smooth immigration thing for people coming from rich countries. In Kenya they do, right? Because Kenya has way more Western immigrants and whatnot, way more. South Africa does too. So you go to Kenya, you go to South Africa, you go to even Mauritius. They've got so many people that come in from the West that they've got a nice, streamlined, smooth immigration system. Yeah, they're expecting you to come there. They've got digital nomad visas in the 3 countries I just mentioned. Because I'm a digital nomad, right? Kenya's got a digital nomad visa program. Nice and easy. You just apply for the digital nomad thing, you show your income, all that, bam, they give you like 2 years or whatever it is, renewable digital nomad visa. Similar thing in Mauritius, nice, easy digital nomad visa. South Africa, I think, have just introduced theirs, but a lot of the other countries in that, they don't have anything like that. They're not used to dealing with digital nomads and all this kind of thing. So that's why it's a bit techie. Big up Ali, he says, what is Bantu? I'm confused. Does it mean West African? Excuse my ignorance, this ain't my area of expertise. That's okay, Ali. So basically, Bantu people were originally a language group So they were a broad group of different tribes from West Africa, thousands of years ago, who spread out from West Africa into East Africa and Southern Africa and Central Africa. They basically populated or colonized other parts of Africa, right? Thousands of years ago. And most black people today are what you would describe as a Bantu phenotype, meaning physically, most black people would be described as Bantu in their physical appearance. Black Americans are physically Bantu, Caribbeans, Nigerians, Ghanaians, so on and so forth. Most black people today would be described as Bantu in their physical appearance. Is it dangerous out here? No. I mean, you don't want to be walking through slums and, doing silly stuff, but generally speaking, no. Bear in mind, I'm coming from Costa Rica. Costa Rica, in the areas I was living, was very, very safe. But in the shady parts of Costa Rica, it's very dangerous. Far more dangerous than it is here. One of the reasons, because in Costa Rica, there's a lot more guns. In Zambia, there's very few guns. It's not like South Africa. South Africa's flooded with guns. But in Zambia, not so much. There's not a lot of guns. Shout out to everyone locked in for the night flight. Hopefully you guys are enjoying it. Covering a broad swathe of topics as usual. NSGS says, who do you think they will match up with Fury and AJ for their tune-ups next year? I forgot who they said. I've heard rumors about who AJ might be fighting, but I've forgotten who it was now. Nobody any good, as you would expect, for a tune-up. I've forgotten who it was. Maybe somebody can jog my memory. AJ was looking to fight Cassius Chaney before he got the Jake Paul fight. So would they maybe revive the Chaney thing? Chaney's pretty awful. I mean, Cassius Chaney got outboxed by George Arias, and that's a shocker. Didn't Chaney also get beaten by Michael Hunter and barely threw a punch? Warren Williams says, I hope Fury and AJ get knocked out. It would be funny to see how they would react. Ed Ellaby says, when you travel, do you only stay in the capital and cities? Well, no. When I lived in Costa Rica, I was living in a coastal town in the Guanacaste province. which is in the Pacific northwest of Costa Rica. I was not living in a city, I was living in a town. Nobody wants to live in San Jose. San Jose is the capital of Costa Rica, and very few gringos choose to stay there. But where I am right now, yes, I'm in a city. NSGS says, I wouldn't say Hrgovic is low risk for this version of AJ or Fury. I agree. S says, how do you get around the language, cultural barrier when traveling? I go to places where there's plenty of English speakers. There was much more of a language barrier in Costa Rica than there is in Zambia. In Zambia, pretty much everyone speaks English. Whereas in Costa Rica, most people don't. But in Guanacaste, there's a very large gringo, foreign population of Americans, Canadians, and other Westerners living in Guanacaste. So, yeah, the language barrier wasn't really a thing. If you move out of the gringo towns, yeah, most Costa Ricans barely speak English, if any at all. No, I don't speak Spanish. And, speaking of what I was touching on earlier with regards to immigration, because Costa Rica historically has got such a massive influx of Westerners, they only just recently introduced the digital nomad visa to Costa Rica, okay? A couple of years ago now. But no one really cared that much about it because Costa Rica has got a tourist visa, which you get, when you arrive at the airport. They just stamp your passport, you don't pay anything. When I first arrived in Costa Rica, they gave you 3 months. Now they give you 6 months, or up to 6. It's at the discretion of the border official, but if you're coming from America or Europe, bro, they're gonna give you 6 months. All right, so they stamp your passport, 6 months. And when you wanna renew that tourist visa, you just literally cross the border for a couple of hours and then you come back into Costa Rica and they stamp you for another 6 months again. I literally met people who had been living in Costa Rica for 15 years, all right? Americans living in Costa Rica for 15 years on a perpetual tourist visa. Just doing a visa run every, 3 months, now every 6 months. Leaving the country for a couple hours, coming back in, and they've been living there doing that for 15 years, bro. Costa Rica is honestly one of the easiest places to stay, just as a foreigner, from an immigration perspective, because you don't actually need residency and all that kind of stuff, unless you want to start a business. If you're like a digital nomad, Costa Rica was so easy, bro. It was so easy. You really didn't have to deal with immigration at all. And that was a good thing, because in any developing country, dealing with immigration is going to be a headache. I can tell you that dealing with the Costa Rican government, if you have to deal with them, trying to get residency and stuff like that, is the nightmare of all nightmares. Yeah. It is such an unbelievable nightmare with the language barrier, and also the legal system that they have in Latin America is totally different to what they have in the English-speaking countries. In Costa Rica, it's like with Spain and, whatnot, where they have like a Roman legal system. I forget the actual official name for it. Because like in America and obviously in Britain, the law is based on English common law, yeah? But in Latin America, they've got this like Roman thing, which is totally different to English common law, and it will give you all sorts of headaches because you won't understand the way it works. Yeah, it's so different. But luckily, as I say, because Costa Rica's got this perpetual tourist visa thing, as a digital nomad, you really don't need to deal with the immigration. In terms of going into the immigration office and trying to get resident, you really don't need to do any of that. So it was very, very easy from a legal perspective to live in Costa Rica. Well, the cost of living in Costa Rica varies massively depending on where you live, right? If you want to live in a gringo town, in many of the gringo towns in Guanacaste, it's expensive, and it's become more expensive now since I've left. It can be very expensive, and it's also seasonal, you know, because at certain times of the year, like during the dry season, that's when you get an uptick in tourists from America and whatnot. And that's when all the landlords and rental owners and whatnot want to bump up their prices significantly, sometimes double or triple their prices. It's crazy. But the way you do it in Costa Rica, if you're looking to stay there long term, is you have to befriend some locals. And you get a local to approach a landlord and agree a price on your behalf. And that's when you come in and say, surprise, I'm the one who's moving. That's how you do it, yeah? That way you don't get gringo priced, you get a reasonable price. Because if you're just dealing with a Costa Rican landlord as a gringo, nah man, he's gonna charge you some stupid amount of money. So you befriend a local, that's the way you do it. Befriend a local, get them to negotiate on your behalf. You might have to, you know, obviously kick them a few colones, which is the Costa Rican currency. They're helping you out, but it'll be far less than what the landlord wants to extort you for. Active Learner says that they cause you issues when they find out you're not a local. Well, they can tell immediately, right? You're not speaking Spanish. You know, immediately you're not a local. So you get gringo priced. That's pretty standard. No, they gringo price you. You know, as soon as they know you're coming from a Western country, oh, they got a whole different price for you. Don't worry about that. That's why you have to use a local to negotiate on your behalf. And it's the same in any developing country. Yeah, when you're not a local, they're gonna try to charge you more. In some countries, it's worse than others. Some countries, they're more ridiculous with it. In Zambia, it's not that bad, to be honest, in terms of like, if we can keep using the term gringo pricing. Obviously, it's not a Spanish-speaking country, but you know, I like that term from my time in Costa Rica. Yeah, obviously there is a certain amount of gringo pricing in Zambia, but it's not as bad as in other countries I've experienced, where they're a lot more aggressive and crazy with the gringo pricing. In Zambia, it's not that bad. It's there, but I've experienced far worse. Ed Ellaby says, didn't America bring over the tipping culture to Costa Rica? Well, the thing about Costa Rica is that it's kind of like the UK, right? Where the workers get a certain amount of commission per sale. Something like that anyway, you know, as included with each transaction. So you really don't need to tip in Costa Rica. It's not set up in the way that American businesses are, but it's a cultural thing in America, so they do tip. But generally, Americans who have lived in Costa Rica a long time, a lot of them won't tip because they understand that, it's more like the British system rather than the American system as far as the way that waitresses and staff get paid. KDS says, what's the worst country you've been to? It depends what you mean by worst, because it's all subjective at the end of the day, right? So, it depends what you mean by worst country. Worst in what way? Worst weather? Worst crime? Worst gringo pricing? Like, worst in what way? Yeah, that's obviously standard Evil Uncle Phil. Tipping culture in America is extremely silly. The entitlement is crazy, even for bad service. Yeah, if somebody's giving you bad service, why the hell should you be tipping? I've never been to a country that I thought was like really bad, to be honest, like where I had a really, really bad experience overall. I've never been to a country like that. So, I don't know. Shout out to everyone in the live chat joining us here on the night flight. NSGS says, is Pulev Anthony Joshua's best win? Obviously not, bro. Pulev. AJ beat Povetkin, better than Pulev. Parker is better than Pulev. Andy Ruiz, better than Pulev. I haven't even mentioned Klitschko yet. I just mentioned a bunch of other guys who were all better than Pulev. And I'm not sure why Klitschko wouldn't count. I mean, he does count. But even the other guys I mentioned are better than Pulev. So. I mean, Povetkin beat Pulev, I think, several times in the amateurs. Povetkin was like the dominant super heavyweight for years in the unpaid ranks. He was like the dominant guy before Camarel. When Povetkin turned pro, that's when Camarel kind of became the main man in the amateur code at super heavyweight. But Povetkin was that guy for years. NSGS says Parker is mid. He's still better than Pulev. So I'm not quite sure why he's saying it's Pulev is AJ's best win. Parker is better than Pulev. He's proven it. Povetkin's better than Pulev. He's proven it, etc., etc. Klitschko, obviously. The GOAT says Pacheco's going to sleep. Right, you're the second person who said this, all right? I haven't seen the guy. I don't think I've ever seen the guy who Pacheco's fighting in action before. So I can't dismiss what you're saying. I've never seen the guy fight. I've seen Pacheco fight. I'm saying his opponent. I don't think I've ever seen him fight. So I'll have a look. Striker says, I'm going to America in March. What happens if I don't tip someone who I feel doesn't deserve it? You know, in America, when you don't tip, you might get an issue from the server, but you're more likely to get an issue from an American customer who might give you a funny look or even say something to you. Like, you're not tipping? Yeah. That's who's more likely to say something. NSGS says, is Parker really better than Pulev though? Who's he beat? Are you kidding? Parker beat Andy Ruiz. Parker beat Deontay Wilder. He beat Jelly Zhang. Where are we going with this? He beat Derek Chisora. Have you forgotten who Parker's beat? Who's Pulev beat? Pulev has beat like Huey Fury and Chisora. That's it. Parker's beat way better guys than Pulev's ever beat. Now, the Andy Ruiz fight was not a robbery. It was a close fight, certainly no robbery. The GOAT says, Sergio fights like him, Billy. He stopped Jack Cullen, another 6'4" dude. Oh, okay, I vaguely remember him. Is Sergio like extremely short? Is he the guy that's like crazy short for a super middleweight? Yeah, Otto Wallin not only beat Gassiev, he hurt him in that fight. Like he had Gassiev wobbling around the ring. You guys remember that? The GOAT says, yeah, he's 5'8" with a 68-inch arm reach. That's a short reach. I'm surprised he isn't shorter than 5'8". If it's the guy I'm thinking of, he was very, very short. SGS says Gassiev was injured or something against Wallin. Well, everyone claims they're injured after they lose, don't they? They always claim something. In some cases, it might be true. In other cases, it's just an excuse. He looked okay to me, Gassiev, and so, you know, I didn't notice he wasn't throwing any punches, or to me, he looked his usual self. It's just that Gassiev is not that good. Certainly not as a heavyweight. Big up Supersized Fries. He says, Hearns versus Bud at 147, who wins? I've been asked this before, and it's a tough one. Because 147 really wasn't Hearns' best weight. He seemed to lack coordination at 147, maybe because of the lack of muscle. When he moved up to 154, he was way better. I think 154 was Hearns' best weight. He didn't stay at 154 that long, but for me, that's where he looked best. As he moved up, middleweight, super middleweight, light heavyweight, he still looked good offensively, but his punch resistance became more of an issue against the bigger guys. Whereas at 154, for me, that was like optimal Tommy Hearns, where he looked well coordinated, he had the speed, he had the power, and the guys weren't so big and strong that his punch resistance was as much of an issue at 154. At 147, Hearns, although he was still very good, I think he was a little drained, truth be told, at 147. So for that reason, I might lean towards Crawford. But obviously, he was still a formidable puncher, Hearns. Do you know what I mean? And a good boxer. Now, I've seen the sparring between Ali and Hearns, and Ali certainly didn't appear to be rocked at all to me. It was like Ali was clowning around in the ring with Hearns, and no, I didn't see Ali hurt at all. Ali was just clowning around. As Ali tended to do, you know, he liked to clown around and do silly stuff. KO Boxing Vibe says, Hatman, do you see Benavidez trying heavyweight in future? Iran Barkley, you know, going back to the Tommy Hearns era, Tommy Hearns fought Iran Barkley a couple of times. And Iran Barkley eventually fought a heavyweight. And that's a former middleweight champion, so anything is possible. I guess it depends on how Benavidez gets on at cruiserweight against Ramirez. If he goes in there and smokes Ramirez, then he might feel emboldened. And it also would depend on the heavyweight landscape at the time. So it's kind of too difficult to say at this stage. There's a lot of ifs. Yeah, Tommy Hearns has been punch drunk for years. Years and years. To quote Slick Rick, this ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh. Just another story about the wrong path. Straight and narrow or your soul gets cast. And I can say that in a mixed up London and American accent because that's how Slick Rick talks. Since he's a guy from London who moved to the United States as a child, and so he's still got this kind of weird blend of American accent and London accent. Good night. There you go. This ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh. Just another story about the wrong path. Straight and narrow or your soul gets cast. Good night. Slick Rick was a G. And by the way, somebody posted a Slick Rick song, a new song from 2025 in my Element group earlier on today. And I was pleasantly surprised by it. I wouldn't expect a washed up old rapper to still be able to produce like music that is basically vintage them. But this track sounds like vintage Slick Rick. The track is called Landlord. And it's literally Slick Rick rapping about being a landlord. Yeah. Look it up on YouTube. It's quite funny. And I want to say that's vintage Slick Rick. Where's Carla says, Hatman, did you say you prefer Shields over Baumgardner physically? If so, respectfully, that's wild. No, I said her body is better than Baumgardner's body. Definitely not the face. Definitely not the face. But the body, definitely, Shields' body better than Baumgardner's body. Baumgardner's got like a gristly, over-defined, like type body. I don't like that kind of body at all. With all muscle definition and six packs and nah, bro. Woman's body's not supposed to be like that. This ain't funny, so don't you dare laugh. Just another story about the wrong path. Straight and narrow, your soul gets cast. Good night. Who else is a Slick Rick fan? Once upon a time, not long ago. Yeah, James, Tony, and Riddick Bowe are punch drunk to high heaven. Both of them just crazy punch drunk. Shout out to the Sweet Mass for the super chat. He says, was Cuss a handler for Mike Tyson? The incessant crying for Mike 40 years later is suspicious. You don't see that same energy for his daughter. Okay, I'm a little confused and intrigued. The Sweet Maps, could you clarify your comment there? Big up for the super chat. I'm not quite sure. Let me read this again. Was Cuss a handler for Mike Tyson? The incessant crying from Mike 40 years later is suspicious. You don't see the... Oh, okay. Are you saying that maybe Cuss interfered with Mike? Is that what you're saying? Or... Because, yeah, Mike lost a daughter, and whenever the daughter is mentioned, you don't see Mike crying. But whenever people mention Cuss, he starts crying. So are you saying that, are you, suggesting that maybe Mike was MK Ultra handled by Cuss, or was it a Nancy thing? Or, I mean, I don't know. But it's a good observation. It is a good observation. Whenever they mention Mike Tyson's daughter, who passed away in a tragic accident, you don't shed a tear. But when they mention Cuss, he's tearing up. I don't know, it's difficult to say with Mike Tyson because when they mention Muhammad Ali, he starts tearing up as well. Have you noticed that? He did meet Muhammad Ali when he was a kid in the Tryon Youth Detention Center, whatever it's called, Tryon School for Boys, Reform School, however you want to describe it. Whenever they mention Muhammad Ali, he starts crying too. So make of that what you will. Starts crying when they mention Ali, crying when they mention Cuss. Mike is a weird guy. So, yeah, I don't know. I mean, Mike said that he got molested as a kid. He said there was some weird dude in the neighborhood who hopped out on him one time and did what he did. And also, Mike's mom was a promiscuous individual. Her and her friends used to have guys around for parties and sleep with these guys. And Mike Tyson said he remembers at least one occasion, because he used to sleep in his mom's bed until he was at least 10, 12 years old or something. And he recalls one occasion where he was sleeping in his mom's bed and he woke up and his mom was like getting smashed by some dude next to him. So Mike's upbringing was traumatic. Do you know what I mean? It was a traumatic upbringing. Truth Channel says you had all the theories about Mike's daughter sacrificed. Yep, I've heard all that as well. Where's Carlos says, Hatman, what's your thoughts on the Brooke Bridges situation? I'm almost surprised that his first relationship after being with his baby mum was with a woman. I'm kind of surprised about that, to be honest. I'm kind of surprised that Brock moved on from his baby mom and hooked up with another woman. If you know what I mean. Yeah, definitely a messed up upbringing for Mike Tyson. Definitely messed up, bro. But remember, he had siblings. His brother Rodney is a very successful person in the field of medicine. You know, Rodney stayed on the straight and narrow, grew up in the same house. Rodney, I think, is a couple years older than Mike. And Rodney, no criminal background, nothing. Went to college, you know, did all that and became, I think he's a surgeon or something like that. You very rarely see Rodney Tyson. Doesn't do interviews. There are some pictures of him online. There's some pictures of Mike with him. But yeah, he stays out of the limelight, Rodney Tyson. That's Mike Tyson's brother, older brother. Even Uncle Phil says, damn, so what happened to his brother Mike? Well, this is why the way you turn out is not just nature, but it's also nurture. It's not one or the other, it's both. Because Mike and Rodney grew up in the same environment, in the same house, with the same parents, and had the same kind of experiences. Rodney also got bullied, just like Mike did, right? But when Mike got bullied, he snapped. Okay, and he turned into a bully himself and a street kid and all that kind of thing. Whereas Rodney just became more introvert. He didn't snap. He stayed away from it all, stayed in the home. Do you know what I mean? Rodney didn't have that beast in him that Mike had. That latent monster from a fighting sense that Mike had in him. Rodney didn't have that. So when he was bullied, he never snapped. He never went in that direction. That's right, Evil Uncle Phil. Rodney was the older brother that Mike didn't listen to. I mean, Mike basically, after he snapped, spoke about how his family was so timid. You know, he described his mother as a timid kind of character. His brother as being timid, his sister. Do you know what I mean? He described them all as like timid type characters. Exactly as Charles B said there. Big up Charles B. It's like when you have a litter of dogs, one can be vicious and another can be meek. Yes. And Mike was meek for a time, but obviously he had some capacity for violence buried inside of him, and it just needed the right amount of bullying to bring it out. That's what happened. Because Mike was kind of like his brother and his, other family members, a meek child, glasses and fat and stuff like that. But the right amount of bullying unleashed the beast that he had buried inside. Even Uncle Phil says Mike was just a crash out from the jump. KDS says Mike and his sister were cutting up Rodney with razors. Yeah, well, even among meek people, they still fight with their siblings. It's just on the street where they were meek with other people. But even the most nerdy, meek people are still going to have a roll around with their siblings. I've seen it. You know, I remember, remember growing up. You know, there was some like nerd brothers, and they'd never fight anyone at school, but they'd fight each other. You know, like that. Now, KO Boxing Vibe says, Hatman, are you interested in the World Cup? Not really. If it's on, I might take a look at it. When is the next World Cup? I've got no idea. I don't keep track of these things. Football's not really my sport. Is the World Cup in 2026? And where is it? I don't even know who the best team is now. Who won the last World Cup? I've got no idea. I'm so out of touch with football. Brazil were the best team in the world the last time I really paid attention to the World Cup. That's how out of touch I am with it, bro. Okay, Argentina always used to be there or thereabouts back in the days as well. Yeah, people are saying Brazil have fallen off so badly. Yeah, so I hear. So I hear. Has there been a shift in Brazil whereby they're more interested now in MMA than they are in football? Is that why? Is there not as much interest in football in the country of Brazil as they used to be back in the days? They're now distracted by MMA? No idea. I'm just throwing it out there as a question. Okay, so this next World Cup is going to be split between the USA, Mexico, and Canada. That's a bit messy. They're splitting the World Cup between those three countries for the same World Cup? How's that going to work? Oh, wow, Trump was doing the draw. Yeah, I'm so out of touch with football that in the Premiership, the last time I paid any attention to the Premiership, Chelsea and Man U and Man City were the three big teams. Chelsea, Man U, Man City. But Man U are now rubbish, right? Last I heard. Man U are bottom half of the table every season. Is that right? That's wild. Because they were dominating for decades. Ed Ellaby says, don't pay attention to anything other than boxing. Yeah, I don't watch anything but boxing. The occasional bit of MMA, but over the past year or so, not even that. I feel like UFC has kind of fallen off a little bit. And that's why Dana White has turned his attention to boxing, because he sensed, since Turki Al-Sheikh got involved in doing boxing events, the UFC was going to have a big problem. So he's trying to get ahead of that problem. I know he's always wanted to involve himself in boxing for a long time. He's always been talking about it. But once he saw what Turki Al-Sheikh was doing for boxing, he was like, nah. I've got to get ahead of this right now, or else UFC is going to have a serious problem. Or my company, should I say, is going to have a serious problem. Me as a businessman, I'm going to have a serious problem of being superseded by boxing, which I've been slagging off for the past few years, right? So, yeah, Dana has turned his attention to boxing because UFC has been in the shadow of boxing since Turki Al-Sheikh came onto the scene, truth be told. Earth Sam says, remember when Akala had a little buzz in the 2010s? I thought he was terrible. I have never heard an Akala track that I ever thought was any good. Akala has never been a good rapper. He was just known because he was Miss Dynamite's brother. KO Boxing Vibe says, hypothetical game, would you support England or Jamaica? Most diaspora or next gen born to Nigerian parents low-key would support Nigeria over England. Well, I'm not from Jamaica. I don't follow football like that, so I really don't care. And when it comes to boxing, nationality or ethnicity and all that kind of stuff isn't really the top of my priority list in terms of who I like. I just like fighters that entertain me and take the fights that they're supposed to take. The thing I like about boxing, actually, is that irrespective of your race or nationality or whatever the case may be, and the stereotypes that come from it, you get to prove everyone wrong. You know, that's the beauty of boxing. There might be a stereotype, or obviously this relates to your ability to fight, your bravery, so on and so forth, your tactics. There might be stereotypes related to people wherever you're from, nationality, race, whatever the case may be, and you can prove them all wrong. So, and I like to see that happen, actually. I like it when people that you wouldn't expect to be able to fight actually can fight. That's what's interesting about boxing. Truth Channel says, got to give him credit, to be honest, he's quite knowledgeable, Akala. Yeah, he might be knowledgeable, but he's got no backbone. As Charles B said there, where was the knowledge in 2020? Akala is like how can I describe him? He's a rebel when it's convenient to be one. You know, like when the BBC want to have him on there to start talking all of his, you know, lefty stuff, the little fake rebel routine. When it's safe to speak out, that's when Akala speaks out. Yeah, a real rebel, someone who's really anti-establishment, they're willing to speak out when it's not safe. Do you know what I mean? They're willing to speak out when you get vilified for doing so by the mainstream. Akala's not that guy. Yeah, they wheel Akala out on slow days. With all the BBC lovies and, you know, that boy's corny, bro. He's corny. Evil Uncle Phil says Akala is now dating Hollywood women. Well, that was probably his reward for staying silent during 2020 and the years that followed. That was probably his reward for that. wow. Even Uncle Phil says Angelina Jolie with Akala must be a reward because WTF. Is he dating Angelina Jolie? That's weird, bro. She's old. Akala must be what, in his 40s? Angelina Jolie must be in her late 40s or 50s. Yeah, that's not really a W as far as I'm concerned, bro. That's not really a W. KO Boxing Vibe says, off topic, what do you think about the whole Trump Venezuela news? I don't know what that news is. Please enlighten me. Look, Vinder Singh says Curtis Woodhouse from a Premier League footballer went on to become a British light welterweight champion. He did indeed. Yeah, Carla's like this fake anti-establishment guy. You know, he's like the safe voice of minorities for the BBC and mainstream media, you know. Corny as hell. Don't rate him. Yeah, he's got knowledge. He's obviously studied history and stuff like that. But in terms of his character, I don't rate him. KO Boxing Vibe says, Trump talking about invading, regime change, funny how it's another oil-rich country. Yeah, Trump has been talking about invading a lot of people. He was talking about invading Nigeria, talking about invading this one and that one. Up to this point, thankfully, Trump has been more talk than action when it comes to invading countries. Thankfully. And it might be more bluster with regards to Venezuela. Who knows? Let's hope it is more bluster. The last thing we need is more conflicts, do you know what I mean? Because Trump likes to just mouth off and say, I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that, and he usually don't do anything. But big up Charles B for the super chat every time. That's my guy, Charles B. Much respect, bro. Much appreciated. Oh, wow. Telstar says, ironic because he gave Trump a peace prize. Is that right? Well, you know, politics is all BS, isn't it? Right? So, for example, Trump's always banging on about the danger of Islamists and, you know, how Islamists are like targeting Christians everywhere. But then the guy that he's just endorsed in Syria is like one of the most hardcore anti-Christian Islamists. You know this guy that he's just endorsed, who's been shaking hands with and patting him on the back? That guy's like a hardcore... Come on, bro. Politics is such BS. Do you know the guy I'm talking about? That Trump has endorsed, I think it's Syria. He was like some hardcore Islamist guy. Like, politics is so stupid, man. That's why I really don't like paying attention to it. Certainly don't engage with it. Because everyone's an actor in politics. You know, they're all just spinning narratives all the time, and it's like, oh man, I ain't got time for this. I ain't got time for all this, man. Yeah, that's the guy. Al Shara. That's the one. Al Shara. He was like some super duper, you know, evil guy before, but now Trump's his buddy. Like, come on, man. Come on. Charles B says, Hatman, have you come across much witchcraft since being in Africa? Personally, no. I've come across many tales of witchcraft, you know, people saying they've experienced it or have seen someone who's had witchcraft put upon them and stuff like that. But have I experienced anything firsthand? No. And I hope not to. To be honest, I hope not to. Big up Charles B. There you go. Ed Ellaby says, yeah, he was on the top 10 FBI most wanted list. He overthrew Assad's moderate government. Yeah. This guy was like the most hardcore Islamist guy. Right? He was public enemy #1. But now all of a sudden, he's cool, according to Trump. Because anyone who knows anything about Syria will tell you that Syria was a secular country. It wasn't like a hardcore Islamic country at all. It was very secular. Was it a dictatorship? Of course it was, but which country in the Middle East isn't? They're all dictatorships, bro. Charles B says, have you heard of the Congo Matter? No, I haven't. What's that? In fact, let me look it up. Oh, wow. Maybe I have heard of it because I've got a book which I've been meaning to do Patreon episodes about. And it's a book about cryptids. And they mention several cryptids in Africa. One of them being, I forget the name of it now, something Matembe, which is this alleged sauropod, a small sauropod that is alleged to live in the Congo, deep in the jungle. In that same book, there also might be this Congo, is it Congomato? Because I'm looking at it on the search engine now. Congomato, Congomama, there are some variations of the name, which looks like a pterodactyl. So that might be in that book. I'll double check in that book. Yeah, I'm interested in weird and wacky stuff like this. That's interesting. It says here, the Congomato is a reported pterodactyl-like creature said to have been seen by natives and explorers in the, is that Mulingwa? Struggling to pronounce that word. Muling, is it Mu? Mulingo. I can't pronounce it. Anyway, it's talking about Western Zambia, Angola, and Congo. All right. Big up Charles B for putting me onto this cryptid here. Very interesting. Charles B says it apparently eats mostly fish. There's a similar story of a cryptid. One thing I do remember from the book was of some type of giant bird, I mean enormous, the size of a small plane, that is somewhere out in the Pacific. New Zealand, Tasmania, somewhere around there. Maybe one of those Pacific islands slightly, further north. And there's tales of this enormous bird going back several hundred years in that part of the Pacific. And there was actually a real bird that they found in the fossil record that was enormous. So the inference is that it lived on until fairly recent times, this giant bird that lived in the Pacific or whatever, the size of a small plane. Yeah. KO Boxing Vibe says, do you think AJ is done if he gets dropped by Jake Paul but still wins? I think AJ is done anyway. I think he's done anyway. It's just a matter of how does he cash out. The plan is to cash out against Partridge, right? But will he even make it that far? We'll see. We'll see. But I think he's done anyway. Well, the Mothman is a very, very interesting episode in American history. I did a two-part Patreon episode about the Mothman, reading excerpts and some of the best eyewitness accounts from the John Keel book, The Mothman Prophecies. John Keel was the journalist who traveled to Point Pleasant during the time of the whole Mothman sightings and documented what was going on, spoke to people on the ground, etc., etc. And I did a two-part episode about the Mothman, and it is inexplicable and bizarre, that whole Mothman thing, because over 100 people in Point Pleasant claim to have seen this thing in the run-up to the Silver Bridge collapse, right? Most of them. 100 adults, including policemen, claim to have seen it. Very, very bizarre. I really don't know what to make of it. Was it mass hysteria or what? I mean, I don't know. Was it some kind of weird social experiment? Was it a demon? I've got no idea, bro. Was it witchcraft? I don't know. Certainly, if you told that story to people here in Africa, they would turn around immediately and say, that's witchcraft. That some kind of sorcerer, some kind of witch doctor has conjured up something. And it's been very interesting, actually. Big up Matt Borgerson, big up the Sweet Maths. I just want to finish this thought, right? When you speak to African people about weird creatures, the first thing that will strike you is how clued up they are about spiritual matters. In the West, unless you really are someone that takes an interest in the occult and the esoteric, then the vast majority of people really have no concept of spirituality at all. Yeah? All they'll know is some superficial stuff about Christianity or whatever, or Islam. But in terms of much deeper, more ancient spiritual principles and whatnot, and the mechanics of spirituality, most people in the West don't know anything about it. Whereas in Africa, the average person, even a young person in their 20s, will be able to tell you about a lot of different spiritual concepts, because paganism, pre-Abrahamic spiritual beliefs are still widespread in Africa, despite the fact that most African countries officially identify as either Christian or Muslim. The indigenous African spirituality is still widely practiced at all levels of society, all right? Which is obviously pagan stuff. And so when you tell them about, let's say, the Mothman in America, they'll say, oh yeah, just a young African person, never mind an older person, will say, oh yeah, that sounds like some kind of witch doctor was up to no good, and they've created some type of entity. And the way they describe these entities is that they're not necessarily, the way they describe them is basically, when a witch doctor conjures up an entity, that entity isn't visible to everybody, but it's often only visible to the people that it's meant to target. And it often can only physically affect the people that it's meant to target. So it's like a psychic attack. You know what I mean? The witch doctor can conjure up some kind of like tulpa or something, which is able to have a physical effect on the person that it's used to target. Right? So that's like the way they'll often describe these things. They'll say, yeah, that's why some people can't see them, because it wasn't conjured up to target you. So in that sense, it might not really exist. It's as if they have a way of affecting the psyche and the perception of the person who's being targeted, such that they hallucinate things maybe. You know what I mean? But these hallucinations are so convincing that it then has an effect on the physical body of the person. That's my understanding in terms of the way these things have been described to me by Africans, right? Big up Matt Borgerson for the super chat. He says, what do you think would happen if Jake Paul stops Joshua? Do you think he would end up fighting Usyk next with a win like that? It's a good question, Matt. And you certainly couldn't rule it out, could you? Although I think he would more likely fight Luke Partridge first, because Partridge would see that as easy money, and he's already spoken about fighting Jake Paul. Yeah, he's already saying it. I'll fight Jake Paul. So if Jake Paul were to pull off the upset, I think it would be more likely that Luke Partridge then fights Jake Paul, and then the winner of that fight takes on Usyk. Big up Matt for the super chat. Big up the sweet Matt. And by the way, Matt, do you think Jake Paul's gonna win? David Hay, I mentioned this earlier on in the stream, he's picking Jake Paul to win, which is a pretty bad sign for Jake Paul. Shout out to the sweet Matt for the super chat. He says, do the next 5 to 10 years decide the future of humanity, i.e. the end of human freedoms, especially in the West? It's a very, very good question. A very, very good question. I tend to think it won't. I could be wrong. Maybe I'm being overly optimistic. I'm just not sure that they're going to be able to implement it the way that they want to implement it, and that it may ultimately fall apart. They're going to try, but the world is a very big place. It's a very fractured place. There are lots of people with different ideas. There are lots of different cliques. There isn't even complete unity within the ruling class, at least not long term. Yeah, they can come together over the short term and agree on certain projects, but over the longer term, there's a lot of bickering even among the ruling class globally. So I think for some countries, they're going to go down a very dark technocratic road, but for other countries, they might actually go in the opposite direction. And everything in between for the rest of the world. So I think it'll be more of a mixed bag. That's my suspicion anyway. Maybe I'm wishful thinking. Or maybe I'll be right, we'll see. Shout out to the Sweet Mass for the super chat. Shout out to Matt Borgerson. Matt Borgerson says, thought over, I'm just kidding. Okay. Big up, Matt. Big up, Charles B. He says, I'm looking at accounts on the Congo Mata, and many of them come from British colonialists, which is interesting. Yes, it is interesting, because that way people can't chalk up such a creature to local superstition. When it's foreign colonialists coming in and they say they're seeing it, I mean, don't get it twisted. It was the case that some colonialists wanted to get famous back in Britain or other parts of Europe by claiming to have seen fantastical beasts. Do you know what I mean? When they visited Africa or Asia or the Americas. That did happen too, but it's also the case that, you know, colonialists went to Africa, and for example, when they first saw gorillas, they reported it back in Europe and they were not believed. Yeah? The first reports of like European explorers and whatnot going into the interior of Africa encountering gorillas, back in Europe, they didn't believe them. They're like, no, you're making this up. You just want to try and get famous or whatever the case may be. The same was the case for the giant panda. That wasn't believed by a lot of people in the West for a long time. They didn't believe that the Western explorers who were going in saying they'd seen these things. Or the Chinese, should I say, who said these things existed. Etc., etc. But yeah, I'm definitely going to look into that one. Shout out to Charles B. Big up Matt for the super chat. He says, I think he's going to land a counter on Joshua and hurt him at least once in this fight. I think he will lose. He will do better than most think. I can see it. I think this fight is going to go at least 7 or 8 rounds, 6 or 7 rounds. Yeah, I think 6 or 7 rounds. And I think AJ is going to get heavily criticized afterwards for what people class as a very poor performance. I think the whole narrative that AJ is supposed to go out there and knock this guy out in a round is a little odd, to be honest. I think it's a little odd because Jake Paul is young, he can move, he's pretty quick. You know, like AJ didn't blast out every journeyman he faced in one round, did he? Some of them went a few rounds, 3, 4 rounds or whatever. Yeah, that was when he was on the come up as a young guy, but now he's on the downslide. So his ability is deteriorating now, AJ. So if you put Jake Paul on the level of, you know, a random journeyman, well, why couldn't a random journeyman take AJ a few rounds? And unlike most random journeymen, Jake Paul's going to be coming with some ambition. So I think this goes a few rounds. I don't see AJ going in there. And AJ's a cautious guy by nature. He's coming off a long layoff. He's coming off a devastating knockout defeat. So I don't see him going in there and just blasting Jake Paul out in a round. I'd be quite surprised if that happens. I think AJ's going to go in there circumspect. He's going to have a look. He's going to stick his jab out there. Some speculative right hands to the body. He's going to try and make Jake Paul feel anxious with his presence and with his size and all that kind of stuff. And then, you know, just take a look at him and not make any silly mistakes. Big up Matt for the super chat. He says, I think Joshua is going to deal with demons in this fight. He's going to be thinking about the Dubois fight and it will show. It's not impossible for the upset. All right, big up Matt. Striker says, and Jake Paul isn't going to stand in front of AJ like Francis. Yeah, I certainly don't think he will. I agree with you. I think he's going to move, especially early on. I think Jake Paul will be on his bike for the first round or so at least. He'll be trying to gauge AJ's speed. You know, can AJ get to me? Gauge AJ's range. At which range is he dangerous? His footwork and his reflexes. He'll be trying to gauge all of this stuff. And AJ will be trying to do the same. So I think the first round or so is going to be a feel-out round for both of them. And then AJ will look to establish his jab. Ed Ellaby says, but do you think Team Usyk will train him for the knockout? I just think they'll train him to not make any technical errors because they're a very technique-focused team. They're perfectionists when it comes to technique and strategy and all that type of stuff. So I think they'll just be focusing on him not making errors and just sticking to the basics. That would be my guess. I don't think they're going to want him to go out there as, you know, like a bull in a china shop and try and knock Jake Paul's head off. I doubt that that's the way they're approaching it behind the scenes. I mean, if you take Jake Paul out of the equation and put Cassius Chaney in his place, who AJ was originally supposed to fight in December, do you really think that the Usyk team will be telling AJ, oh, you got to go out there and blast Chaney out in a round or two. You got to go out really aggressive. I don't think they'll be telling him to do any of that. They know he's coming off a knockout defeat. They know he's coming off a loss. They know that his confidence is down. I don't think after that, in the layoff, they'll be telling him to go out there and blast Chaney out. No, I think they'll be telling him, go out there, relax, use your jab, just find yourself in the ring, box your way into it. And I think they'll be telling them the same thing against Jake Paul. You got Matt for the super chat. He says, at this point, how can you say that Jake Paul isn't more experienced in striking and boxing than Ngannou? He's been specialized in it longer than him. Well, he certainly hasn't been, you know, doing striking longer than Ngannou. Ngannou, much older than Jake Paul, and was, you know, striking in MMA long before Jake Paul ever laced up gloves. But as far as boxing specifically, yeah, Jake Paul's obviously more experienced in professional boxing than Ngannou. Ngannou's only had 2 professional boxing fights. But in terms of combat sports overall, which, you know, striking is punching and kicking, Ngannou's got way more experience than Jake Paul. Ngannou's what, 40? Matt says, UFC striking is inferior. Well, you mean punching, because obviously in boxing there is no kicking. Yeah, but look who Jake Paul's been fighting. He's been fighting a bunch of UFC guys. So it's not like Jake Paul's been out there, you know, fighting excellent boxing, you know, boxers. He hasn't. He's been fighting mostly UFC guys, right? With the exception of Chavez Jr., who was never particularly good anyway. He was just a weight bully at middleweight, whose best years are, what, over a decade ago? So other than Chavez Jr., it's just been Jake Paul fighting or beating ex-MMA guys. And when he fought an actual boxer who was young, he lost to Tommy Fury. Shout out to Matt for the super chat. He says, you're telling me Jake Paul wouldn't stop Tommy Fury in a rematch? I think he'd beat him at this point. Paul has dramatically improved since then. You see, the problem with saying that someone has dramatically improved is you'd have to put him in there against Tommy Fury again, or someone of a similar level to Tommy Fury, to be able to gauge. Because Jake Paul's been fighting, what, a 60-year-old Mike Tyson? MMA fighters like Anderson Silva? Do you know what I mean? Like, he hasn't been fighting anyone to really get a gauge on how much improvement is there. Because up until the Tommy Fury fight, he was knocking people out, right? He was looking sharp. But when he got in there against Tommy Fury, he looked slow. His coordination was bad, right? He made Tommy Fury look like Muhammad Ali. But up until that fight, Jake Paul didn't look that bad. Yeah, he looked terrible in the Tommy Fury fight. Because Tommy Fury was doing things that threw Jake Paul off. That's why Jake Paul didn't look as sharp and didn't look as agile against Fury as he had done against previous opponents. So to be able to really gauge how much Jake Paul has improved since Tommy Fury, we need to see him in against comparable opposition. You know, he's been fighting people that can't do anything to him. MMA guys, old men, slow guys, you know? So it's hard to really judge how much he's improved. What I will say is that he's been a lot more active than Tommy Fury, obviously. And that would stand him in good stead in a Tommy Fury rematch. But notice that Jake Paul isn't really targeting a Tommy Fury rematch. If he was so confident that he would knock out Tommy Fury now, he'd be offering Tommy Fury to fight. Because that's the only stain on his record. But he's not offering Tommy Fury to fight, or at least not with any real seriousness, is he? So if he's improved as much as you believe he has, Matt, why is he not targeting Tommy Fury? If that's an easy win for him now. Wouldn't he want to right that wrong before moving on to bigger and better things? Just a thought. Maybe he hasn't improved as much as you think. Or else, like I say, why not run it back with Tommy? Let's pay Tommy what he wants. There's plenty of money in the pot. Run it back. Shout out to Matt for the super chat. Big up the amateur. He says, is there VADA testing in the Paul fight? I've got no idea. Does anyone in the chat know? Is there VADA testing for the AJ Jake Paul fight? Does anyone know? Matt says, would you rather make 80 million for fighting a 60-year-old or 2 million to fight a who? I think it's more money driven. Why not get paid? Yeah, but it's not an either or though, is it? He can do both. He could fight Tommy Fury and then he could fight the 60-year-old. He doesn't have to do one or the other. He could do both. But he doesn't seem to want to target Tommy Fury at all. Interesting. You know what I mean? Like if Tommy Fury is such an easy win for him now, why not run it back? Even Uncle Phil says, Paul getting pizza to bulk up in his recent MVP upload. Yeah, but a lot of that is just trolling. You know, Jake Paul takes his camps very seriously. So, you know, a lot of the stuff he does on social media, he's just trolling. CC says, if Chavez was weight bullying middleweights, why wouldn't AJ weight bully Paul Paul is outmatched in every way. I'm interested to know why you feel he can go 7. Povetkin and White went 7 with AJ. Because Povetkin and White went 7 with a much younger, fresher, more confident version of AJ than the version we have today. AJ is now what, nearly 36? He's coming off the longest layoff in his career. He's coming off the most devastating loss in his career. Like, do you know what that does to a fighter psychologically? To get knocked out like that in front of all those people? All kind of demons will be in his mind. AJ doesn't get over these things very easily. He gets haunted by these things. We saw that from the Klitschko fight. We saw that from the first Ruiz fight. He gets haunted. If he was haunted by those experiences, coming off the Dubois fight, how haunted do you think he's going to be now? At the age of what, nearly 36? Yeah? So he's not the same guy that fought Povetkin and White all those years ago, physically or psychologically. So I think the fight can go at least 6 or 7 rounds if AJ comes out and he's very cautious and he's a little unsure and he plays it safe. Yeah, if he does that, I can see the fight going 6 or 7 rounds. That's what I'm expecting to happen. If it was the AJ who fought, as you know, if it was the heavyweight champion version of AJ, I wouldn't expect it to go that long. Yeah, but it's not the heavyweight champion version of AJ anymore. So I expect him to be more cautious and just play it safe, use his jab, and not get too ambitious. Unless he sees Jake Paul really wilting, I don't think he's going to get too ambitious. I think he'll play it safe, secure the bag, and move on to the next one. But we'll see. Yeah, AJ really took a beating in that Dubois fight. That's a good point, the amateur. AJ's chin, which was never a great chin to begin with, might be even worse now after what happened against Dubois. Big up Charles B. He says, I can only see one outcome. AJ absolutely flattening him like he did to Ngannou. You know, one thing that I see with Jake Paul is that he wastes a lot of energy in the ring. Paulie Malignaggi pointed this out. It's really true. He was so jittery against both Mike Tyson and also Chavez Jr. When Chavez Jr. would feint at him, Jake Paul would jump back like 5 feet from a feint off Chavez Jr. Like, all that wasted energy, you could have just done a much more subtle defensive movement and been perfectly safe. The fact he's making these dramatic defensive movements is a sign of his inexperience. Wasting all that energy, right? An experienced pro is going to notice that immediately when they're in the ring with you. They're going to feint and they're going to see you jump back 5 feet and they'll say, you know what, I'm going to keep feinting. Let him waste that energy. I'm going to torture him mentally. I'm going to throw some big shots occasionally behind the feints. They're going to notice that immediately, that you're overreacting to their feints. Yeah? So, Jake Paul's going to need to sort that out against Anthony Joshua. I mean, or else any hope of him scoring a miraculous victory is going to go up in smoke very quickly. All of that jumping away 5 feet because of a feint, you need to stop that. Big up the amateur for the super chat. He says, I think Jake carried Mike towards the end. I agree. I think he did. I think it was a mixture of him carrying Mike, but also not wanting to get clipped by a 60-year-old because he had the fight in the bag. What a disaster it would have been to be so far ahead on the cards and then get clipped by one big punch from a 60-year-old man when he was winning so easily. So I think it was kind of partly because he kind of felt sorry for how bad Mike was in there, but also because he didn't want anything silly to happen to himself. That's my take on it. Coppen says, does AJ have feints? Does AJ have the IQ to notice? Absolutely he has feints. And absolutely he has the IQ to notice. And he was feinting against Ngannou, and that's how he got Ngannou to walk onto the shots. AJ would feint first. He'd see Ngannou's reaction. If Ngannou didn't react, that's why he threw the right hand the way that he did. If you watch before that right hand that drops him in the first round lands, AJ feints a couple times. And he notices Ngannou's not going for the feints, so he's like, okay, I think I can catch you from this distance with a real punch. Your reactions don't seem fast enough here. This is what AJ would have been telling himself in his subconscious. Your reactions to my feints are not fast enough. Therefore, I'm going to let a right hand go. Let one go and down Ngannou went. Then in the second round, Ngannou was reacting to the feints because he realized AJ was quick enough to catch him. So AJ then started using the feints in that second round a bit differently. And again, Ngannou's low left hand was what was behind, well, he basically jabbed from too close. And AJ caught him with a right hand over the jab and dropped him. That was the second knockdown. The third knockdown was academic. Ngannou was gone. Shout out to the amateur for the super chat. He says, imagine if AJ loses, he'd have two of the biggest boxing upsets and would never have won a fight in the US Hall of Fame status revoked. Well, that's the reason this fight is going to do such great numbers. Because people will be intrigued. Well, half of the audience will be intrigued because they hate Jake Paul. They want to see him get obliterated. And the other half will be curious to see whether a monumental upset is about to happen. That's why the people are going to tune in. That's why this fight is going to do such great numbers on Netflix. Personally, I think, even though from a commercial perspective, it's an understandable fight for AJ to take, given the fact that he's been so desperate to gain the respect of the boxing community over the years, this is a very foolish fight to take because he doesn't need it. He's got more money than he could ever require, Anthony Joshua. So, okay, he might see it as an easy payday against a YouTuber, but you don't need this easy payday. You've got plenty of millions. This is a lose-lose situation from Anthony Joshua from a reputation perspective. There is no victory to be had here for AJ outside of the US market. In the US market, yeah, the perception that American, particularly casuals, but even a lot of people in the boxing community in America have of AJ is so low, like they hold him in such low regard, that a devastating win over Jake Paul would probably elevate him a bit in their eyes. But outside of the kind of unusual perception of the American boxing market, there is no victory to be had here from a reputation standpoint for Anthony Joshua. If he knocks Jake Paul out in a couple of rounds, well, he was supposed to do that. What a joke fight. What an evil guy for going in there and beating up a YouTuber, right? If he has any problems, oh my God, he was always a hype job to begin with. A YouTuber gave him problems. If he gets knocked out, oh my God, AJ is the worst heavyweight champion in history. So literally, outside of the American market, this is a lose-lose for Anthony Joshua as far as his reputation. So for that reason, I think it's a foolish fight for him to take. You don't need the money. Charles B says, did you see Tate say Tank would have been a harder fight for Jake? I didn't see that. That's a bizarre comment from Andrew Tate, but Andrew Tate don't really know anything about boxing. I agree with D-Man. I think Jake has got a better chance against Wilder. I agree with that. I absolutely agree with that. You see, as a fighter ages, their athleticism declines. Their reflexes get slower. Their hand speed and foot speed gets slower. Their punch output reduces. Their stamina reduces. You see, this is what happens as a fighter ages. And that is why, as you age, your technique becomes more and more important. When you're younger, you can get away with certain things because of your reflexes and your speed and your athleticism, your power, so on and so forth. But as you age, and you can no longer rely on the reflexes as heavily and the speed and all that kind of stuff, you're going to need solid technique to fall back on. Anthony Joshua's technique has always been better than Deontay Wilder's technique. It's just boxing fundamentals have always been better. And that's why AJ, even now, in my view, is a much harder fight for Jake Paul than Deontay Wilder, because Wilder's just so all over the place, technically. There are a lot more opportunities. And now that he's no longer the same athletic specimen that he was, you know. Shout out to Grizz, he says, I'm still not confident that this fight goes ahead. My thoughts on proper boxing, I think he's done fantastically well. I think he did very, very well to come up with that formula for making videos with the witty banter and all that kind of thing, little cockney witty banter stuff. I think he's done fantastically well, you know, fantastically well. Big up proper boxing. Railway and boxing fan says Jake Paul versus Pat Brown. Jake Paul versus Pat Brown. I mean, now that's a fight which really could end in a couple of rounds. Pat Brown would absolutely decimate Jake Paul. I mean, that would be ugly, right? Because unlike AJ, who's, you know, a much bigger guy than Pat Brown, but older, coming off a long layoff, he's on the downslide, coming off a devastating knockout defeat. Pat Brown is like a young, upcoming, high testosterone, you know, very aggressive young fighter. Bro, he would absolutely rip Jake Paul to pieces. That would be horrible. Up to Pat Brown against Jake Paul? Nah, bro. That would be a mugging, bro. He's not going to come out circumspect at all against Jake Paul. Nor would he have to. Right? He would just go in there and absolutely demolish Jake Paul. Yo, that'd be one of the ugliest things you'll have ever seen in a boxing ring, in a high-profile fight. That'd be so ugly. Yeah, I remember Kimbo. Kimbo was also from the Bahamas. Some people may not be aware of that, but Kimbo Slice is actually Bahamian. His real name is Kevin Ferguson. Born in the Bahamas, but grew up in Miami. His family all still, or a lot of his family still live in the Bahamas now. But yeah, he died very young, like, I want to say in his mid-30s or something. He was pretty damn young when he died. I want to say mid-30s. Very strange. Kimbo Slice, unlike John Fury, was a real bare knuckle man. John Fury just talks about bare knuckles and claims he, you know, beat some Irish bare knuckle champion for 100 grand but can't remember his name. Kimbo Slice, oh, he had real bare knuckles and they were filmed and he knows all their names. Remembers what money he was paid and everything. So Kimbo was a real bare knuckle man. Big up D-Man for the super chat. He says, also, Jake hasn't even felt power like AJ yet. The jab alone will be interesting. Always thought AJ's jab is decent, more than people say. Indeed. The first time he gets hit with that jab, or even a right hand to the chest, Jake Paul's going to be having kittens, bro. He's going to be having kittens the first time he gets hit solid. Even to the body or to the arm, he's going to be like, whoa. The amateur says he's been sparring with Okolie and Sanchez. I'm sure he has an idea, at least with headgear. Okolie has a mean right hand and a great jab. Yeah, he has been sparring those guys, but I seriously doubt that they've been allowed to hit him with anything serious. I seriously doubt that. Not just because of the experience gap, but also because they could jeopardize the fight. If Lawrence Okolie goes in there and he's letting go with full-blooded right hands and he knocks Jake Paul out cold, do you really think they're going to continue with the fight and put Jake Paul in there against AJ? I don't think so. So, look, I'm not in the camp. I don't know for certain. I'm speculating here, but I seriously doubt that the sparring he's doing with those guys is like proper sparring where they're not holding back. I seriously doubt it. I think they're wearing, you know, big 18, 20-ounce gloves, headgear, and they're not really giving it full whack, I would strongly suspect. Whereas with AJ, 10-ounce gloves, and as far as we're aware, he's going to try and hit him properly. It'll be a whole different world for him. Big up D-Man, he says, headgear and big gloves is a different ball game. What do I think of Adam Azim? I think he's coming along very nicely. I was a little unsure, more than a little unsure of Adam Azim in his early career. Very unsure about him. But over his past few fights, I'm kind of warming to him now. I'm becoming a bit more confident in his potential. And, you know, I really liked his last fight. I think he showed different dimensions. Inside game, outside game, great fitness, the hand speed, of course. So, yeah, I think he's coming along nicely, Adam Azim. And now that the bigger names, well, actually, Tio Lopez against Shakur Stevenson is going to be at 140. But eventually those bigger names are going to all move up to 147. And 140 will be a bit more open, right, for the likes of Azim. So, yeah. Big up D-Man, he says, do you know if Akoli and AJ fell out? I'm not sure, but the fact that Akoli is now in Jake Paul's camp and he offered to help Jake Paul makes you suspect that perhaps they did fall out, or are they still secretly friends and Akoli's been sent into the Jake Paul camp as some kind of Trojan horse, you know, where he's really a spy for AJ. I don't know. Maybe he's gone in there to soften Jake Paul up for AJ. The amateur says, they definitely fell out. Akoli and AJ don't follow each other on Instagram anymore. And also Akoli isn't on good terms with Hearn. I think AJ may have taken Hearn's side in the big matchroom split Akoli had. JR says, your down goes Johnny moment was funny, but before that, Fisher looking shaky had me dying. I wish I'd done a live stream for Fisher's last fight, you know, on the Monaco card. That would have been fun too, because it was down goes Johnny again. Poor Johnny Fisher. Dave Allen has now told Johnny Fisher to retire. Yeah, Dave Allen, who was very encouraging of Johnny Fisher before, but after that fight in Monaco, his comeback, he's like, nah, man, Johnny, you need to look at other options. You need to look at other options, bro, because this is gonna end badly. You know, shout out to Johnny Fisher for being a trier. I have to respect the effort he's putting in. I have to respect it. But I don't know, man. What's his ambition? What does he really want to do in boxing? Evil Uncle Phil says, the effort deserves no respect. I know Tete will stop him. Damn. Can you imagine if Ebenezer Tete stopped Johnny Fisher? What a disaster that would be. Ebenezer Tete is a swingers. As rubbish as he is, if he senses any kind of weakness in you, he will swing. Ebenezer Tete, I mean, he just comes across to me like an on-smoke taxi driver from Ghana. You know what I mean? Like the kind of cab driver who, if you get into a row with him over the fare, you want to shoot the fade outside. You know what I mean? He'll stop the cab. Let's settle this. You know, one of them ones. You find yourself tussling with a middle-aged cab driver in traffic in Accra, and it's Tete. Yeah, Tete, you know, his official age, boxing age, is in his mid-30s, but bro, there is just no way that that guy's in his mid-30s. I'm telling you now, that's an African age, right? Like those African footballers, that guy's closer to 50. There is no way on earth that he's, do you know what I mean? Like, Tete younger than Adeola Depot. Does he look younger than Adeola Depot to you? Like, come on. Tete's younger than me. There is no way that Tete looks younger than me, or even close, bro. Like, that guy, I'm telling you, is close to 50. He even moves like a 50-year-old. Like his body, you know when you get older and your body starts to sag and the muscles look different and all that kind of thing? Yeah, Tete's got that. He's got like an old man looking body. There's no way that guy's not even close to his mid-30s. That's some like ridiculous fake African age. Yeah, I've seen Wilder's interviews, and yes, he does seem revitalized, doesn't he? He does seem more like his old self in interviews, I agree. Railway boxing fan says, so why is he lying about his age then? Well, it's kind of a tradition now, right? For African athletes to lie about their age in order to get opportunities in the West. They've been doing it in football for decades. Yeah, loads of those African footballers have been exposed for being like 10 years older than their stated age. Like loads of them have been exposed for that now, loads of them. Because if they gave their real age, they wouldn't get signed by these clubs. Similar thing for boxers, I guess, or this is at least the thinking of the boxer. If I give my real age, they're gonna say, nah, this is an old man, he's rubbish, so on and so forth. We need someone that at least on paper looks a bit more credible. You know what I mean? So in order to get any kind of opportunities, let me knock a decade off my age. Or more. So it's a thing that African athletes do. Yeah? They dramatically understate their age because they think they're going to get better opportunities. And the Cubans do it as well. Yeah? A lot of them Cuban fighters, I'm telling you, bro, they're way older than, than they claim to be. Because who's going to sign a guy coming from Cuba if he's 40? If he claims he's 30 with an Olympic pedigree, okay, maybe they'll sign him. If he's coming over from Cuba, he's 38, 40, no one's going to sign him. And they come off them boats. Some of them literally come over on a boat or a raft from Cuba. Others defect, and they've got no papers. So how do you prove that they're not the age they're telling you they are? These guys can make up whatever age they want. You know what I mean? Once they land in the West, they say whatever they want. And if they're looking to make money as a professional boxer, obviously they're going to give you a younger age. If they're an older guy, they're going to give you a younger age. There you go. JR says, an old African footballer, Finidi George, was masquerading as 31 and was really in his mid-40s. Yeah, they've been doing that for decades, bro. They've been doing that for decades. Ed Ellaby says you can examine the bone to determine the age. Yeah, but nobody's going to do that, bro. I can't imagine any immigration office is going to, yeah, let's examine your bone to make sure you're the age that you say you are. They're not going to do that. Big up D-Man, he says, there's a show on border security where this Nigerian, clearly in his late 30s, claimed he was 16 and a minor. Oh my God. And was in the UK to meet Mr. London. I'll give you some example. You just look it up, just go on a search engine. Look it up now. So here we have an article, loads of articles. Look, this one is from DW.com. Age fraud. African football is trying to combat it. Another article here from the BBC. Why the problem of age fraud is rampant in African football. Here's one from Pulse Ghana. 10 players caught lying about their real age. Here's one from The Guardian. Forever young, Nigerian football's age-old problem. Right, again, it's all the fake ages. This one's from CNN. Football's age fraud. FIFA probes players with 4 birthdays. And they're all African footballers, right? Yo. So, yeah, all these different mainstream Western articles that go into it and all the different instances of these African footballers lying about the age. And also the athletes do it. Yeah, there are loads of African runners lying about their age, giving fake ages so they can get spots on these athletics teams and stuff like that so they don't get written off by the coaches. They just lie about their age. Some of them come with fake documents, because in Africa it's a lot easier to get hold of like fake documents, fake birth certificates and stuff like that, you know, because of the corruption and whatnot. Get hold of some fake documents and you extend your career. No, I think loads of boxers lie about their age. African boxers, as I said, and also Cuban boxers. I think they're probably the 2 biggest culprits for age fraud in boxing, would be Cuban boxers and African boxers. All right, peeps. Gonna bring this night flight to an end now, so buckle your seatbelts, store your trays, and put your seats in an upright position and prepare for landing. I'd like to thank you all for traveling on Hatman Airways. I'd like to wish you a pleasant onward journey. This is your captain speaking, over and out. Before I go, shout out to everyone who participated in the conversation. Special shout out to those who donated via Super Chat. They were Gaz, D-Man, Ben Odom, Jaden Ellis, Super, Abraham, Kayvon Green, Supersized Fries, The Sweet Maths, Charles B, Matt Borgerson, The Amateur, Grizz, big up, big up. And if you could all do the courtesy of sticking a like on this stream, on your way out, it'll be much appreciated. Again, great conversation, guys. Catch you on the next one. I'm out.